What does it feel like to stand alone at the edge of the world, with every rational voice around you urging surrender and yet refuse? What does it take to look at a continent consumed by darkness, at allies fallen, at armies driven into the sea, and say simply that this is not over? Winston Churchill was not a perfect man. He was stubborn, contradictory, occasionally infuriating, and absolutely convinced, even when the evidence argued otherwise, that he was right. Tonight, we find out why that mattered more than almost anything else in the 20th century. Blenheim and blood, the world Churchill was born into good evening, and welcome back to almighty sleep. Tonight's journey takes us into one of the most extraordinary lives in modern history, a life so large, so turbulent, and so packed with incident that it seems almost implausible that it belonged to a single human being. We're going to follow Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill from his very beginning, a cold November night in an Oxfordshire palace, all the way to the end of a life that spanned nearly a century and touched the fate of the entire world. Before we move any further, let me take just a brief moment. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, do tell me where you're listening from tonight, and what time it is in your corner of the world. I always love seeing the spread of places that join us for these long, quiet dives into history. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let us ease into tonight's journey together. To understand Winston Churchill, you first have to understand the world he arrived in. Not the world in the abstract sense, but the very specific, very particular world of the British aristocracy in the second half of the 19th century. It was a world of staggering privilege, of ancient titles and country houses, of empire painted red across every map, of a ruling class so certain of its place in the cosmos that doubt itself seemed almost impolite. Churchill did not arrive into this world modestly. He arrived at its very summit. On the 30th of November, 1874, in a small room on the ground floor of Blenheim Palace in Oxfordshire, a woman named Jenny Churchill gave birth somewhat ahead of schedule to a boy who would not wait for a more convenient moment. This was, in retrospect, characteristic. Winston Churchill spent most of his life arriving before anyone was quite ready for him. Blenheim Palace is worth pausing on for a moment, because it is not the sort of place where most historical figures begin. It is one of the grandest private houses in England, an enormous Baroque palace built as a gift from a grateful nation to the first Duke of Marlborough, who had saved Europe from the armies of Louis XIV of France. It has over 300 rooms. It sits in vast parkland designed by Capability Brown. It is frankly absurd, and Winston Churchill was born in it. His father, Lord Randolph Churchill, was one of the most brilliant and erratic politicians of the Victorian age, a man of ferocious wit and devastating phrase who rose to become Chancellor of the Exchequer at 37, and then, in one of the most spectacular acts of political self-destruction in British history, resigned over a budget dispute expecting to be called back. He was never given high office again. His mother, Jenny Jerome Churchill, was American, extraordinarily beautiful, socially electric, and by the conventions of her aristocratic world, largely elsewhere. Children in houses like the Churchills were raised by nannies and visited by parents at set times like appointments. For Winston, the most constant and loving adult presence was not his parents, but a woman named Elizabeth Everest, his nanny, whom he called Woomany. When she died in 1895, he was at her bedside and paid for her funeral from his own modest resources. He kept her portrait in his room for the rest of his life. Beneath the grandeur and the rhetoric and the cigars, there was always that person. The one who remembered who'd been kind to him when he was small and had no power whatsoever. The England of Churchill's childhood was at the height of its imperial confidence. The empire covered a quarter of the earth's surface, the Royal Navy ruled the seas, and the word British was treated, in certain circles, as more or less synonymous with the word civilized. Churchill absorbed this world completely, its certainties and its blind spots in equal measure. He would spend the rest of his life both embodying its values and, in the moments that mattered most, transcending them. That tension between the Victorian imperialist and the defender of freedom is what makes him so endlessly complicated, and so endlessly worth the attention. A lonely boy in a grand house, childhood and school. The story of Winston Churchill's childhood is, in many ways, a story about loneliness. And I say this not to be dramatic, because frankly there is enough drama coming later in this narrative to keep us all occupied for several hours, but because it is simply true, and because it shaped him in ways that lasted his entire life. The Churchill household was not an unkind one. It was simply a preoccupied one. Lord Randolph was consumed by politics, careening between triumph and catastrophe with a kind of energy that leaves little room for attendance at school plays. Jenny was consumed by society. Both parents were brilliant, both were charming, and both were largely elsewhere. Winston's brother Jack, who arrived 6 years after him, was easier, gentler, less demanding. Winston, from earliest childhood, was intense, restless, argumentative, and absolutely certain that his opinion was worth hearing. These are not qualities that make a child easy to be around. They are, however, qualities that make a man very hard to ignore. His relationship with his parents was defined by longing, not primarily resentment, though that too had its place, but a genuine and painful desire for attention and approval that was never quite satisfied. He wrote to his mother constantly from school, not the careful brief letters Victorian children were trained to produce, but long urgent imploring letters barely concealing the hope that she would visit, that she would write back, that she would notice him. She often did not come. Lord Randolph, for his part, wrote to his son in terms that would make a modern reader wince, describing Winston as a boy of little cleverness and less application. The young Winston appears to have believed this, at least partly, which is part of why the drive to prove himself never quite left him. His schools did not help matters initially. St George's in Ascot operated on principles of strict discipline and corporal punishment, and Winston responded to the caning with a stubbornness that must have been maddening for his teachers. He would not be broken. He would not apologise for things he did not believe were wrong. His teachers wrote home to say he was troublesome, willful, and gave more attention to tormenting the teacher than to learning his lessons. This was, with some variations in vocabulary, essentially what every school Winston attended would say about him. What saved him, academically speaking, was Harrow. Not the prestigious parts of Harrow, where clever boys conjugated Latin and Greek. Churchill entered the lowest form and stayed there for some time, which was arguably the best thing that could have happened to him. He spent 3 years under a teacher named Mr. Somerville, who drilled English grammar and composition with a thoroughness that the higher forms received in classical languages. Churchill later said that while the clever boys learned Latin and Greek and knew a little English, he learned English and knew nothing else. The English he learned was not decorative, it was structural. He learned how sentences worked, how rhythm functioned, how clarity and force were achieved. These lessons became the foundation of one of the greatest prose styles of the 20th century, not a bad return on a failed Latin examination. He also kept an army of 1,500 toy soldiers, which he organised into formations and moved through elaborate imaginary campaigns. Lord Randolph came to inspect this army once, watched with bemusement, and then asked Winston whether he would like to go into the army. Winston said yes, because he thought his father was offering him a choice. Lord Randolph had simply concluded his son was not intelligent enough for the law. Churchill told this story on himself in his memoir, which suggests he recognised both the humour and the sadness of it. He became a soldier by a process of parental misunderstanding. History, being the irregular thing it is, had no objection to this arrangement. Lord Randolph died in January 1895, at the age of 45. Winston was 20 years old. What he lost was not so much a father as the possibility of ever having one. He would spend decades studying his father's speeches and career, trying through research what intimacy had never provided. The biography he eventually wrote is still considered a serious historical work. It is also, quietly and unmistakably, a love letter. He overcame his childhood, but he also carried it, and that weight was one of the engines that moved the world. Soldier, correspondent, adventurer. The making of a young man. Winston Churchill was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the 4th Queen's Own Hussars in February of 1895. He was 20 years old, he had just lost his father, and he had roughly £500 a year to live on from his mother's somewhat diminished fortune. This was not enough for a cavalry officer in the Victorian Army who was expected to maintain horses, a uniform allowance, a mess subscription, and the general appearance of gentlemanly ease. Churchill needed money, and he needed it in a way that was compatible with the demands of his regiment and his considerably larger ambitions. He found the answer in journalism. It was not an obvious solution for a young cavalry officer, but Churchill was never particularly constrained by the obvious. He realised, with the practical calculation that coexisted in him alongside the grandest of romantic impulses, that wars and imperial adventures were happening across the empire and beyond. that newspapers would pay for first-hand accounts of them, and that a junior officer with some facility for prose and an absolute absence of anything resembling fear was ideally positioned to provide those accounts. His first adventure took him somewhere that might seem an unexpected destination for a newly commissioned British cavalry officer. He went to Cuba. In the autumn of 1895, Cuba was in the midst of an armed uprising against Spanish colonial rule. This had nothing whatsoever to do with the British Empire, but it had everything to do with a young man who wanted to see a war, and had arranged with the Daily Graphic newspaper to pay him £5 per dispatch from the front. He obtained leave from his regiment, travelled to New York where he met various dignitaries, with the ease of someone who had grown up assuming that dignitaries were the natural company of a Churchill, then sailed to Cuba and attached himself to the Spanish army as an observer. He spent several weeks in the Cuban jungle, was shot at on his 21st birthday, which he found tremendously exciting, ate questionable food, contracted malaria, and produced dispatches that were competent, vivid, and thoroughly partisan in favour of the Spanish, which created some controversy when published. He also developed in Cuba a taste for Havana cigars and afternoon naps, two habits that stayed with him for the rest of his life. It is safe to say that of all the legacies of that Cuban adventure, the afternoon nap may have been the most consequential for British history. An argument could be made, and this is not entirely a joke, that the fate of the free world depended in part on Churchill's capacity to sleep between lunch and dinner. He returned to his regiment in early 1896 and within months was on his way again, this time to India. The 4th Hussars were posted to Bangalore and Churchill went with them. India, at least the Bangalore portion of it, was quiet. There were no battles. There was polo, which Churchill played with fierce enthusiasm despite a persistent shoulder injury, and there was a great deal of time in the long hot afternoons that he spent reading. He read with the methodical hunger of someone who knew he had missed a proper education, and intended to remedy the deficit entirely on his own terms. He wrote to his mother requesting books, long lists of them, history, philosophy, economics. He worked through all 12 volumes of Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, which is a commitment that most people make only theoretically and never actually execute. He read Macaulay, Adam Smith, Plato, Aristotle, Schopenhauer, and Hallam's Constitutional History of England. He was conducting a university education for himself in the tropical heat of southern India, and it was probably more thorough than anything Harrow or Sandhurst had managed to provide. In 1897, opportunity arrived in the form of a tribal uprising on the northwest frontier. A punitive expedition was sent to the Malakand region. Churchill had not been posted to it. He invited himself anyway, badgering his way to the front as a press correspondent for the Daily Telegraph, and as an unpaid observer for anyone who would have him. What followed was several weeks of intense frontier fighting, sudden ambushes in narrow mountain passes, charges and retreats across rocky ground. Churchill was in the thick of it, and found, with characteristic honesty about himself, that he had a genuine love of fighting, not bloodlust exactly, but a sharpening of the senses that he found intoxicating. He was mentioned in dispatches for his bravery, and produced from the experience his first published book, The Story of the Malakand Field Force, which was well received by critics and, more usefully for his purposes, by several senior politicians, including the Prime Minister. He was 23 years old and becoming known. He was not yet satisfied. There was another war in Sudan, where Kitchener's army was advancing toward Khartoum. Churchill applied for attachment to the force. Kitchener, who had heard of this pushy young lieutenant and his dispatches that did not always reflect well on senior commanders, refused. Churchill applied again. Kitchener refused again. Churchill went around Kitchener entirely, lobbied everyone, including the Prime Minister, and secured a position through the War Office over Kitchener's explicit objections. Kitchener was furious. Churchill went to Sudan anyway. The ability to absorb a refusal and simply continue as if it had not been issued was, throughout his career, one of his most distinctive qualities. The Battle of Omdurman in September of 1898 was the last great cavalry charge in British military history, and Churchill rode in it with the 21st Lancers against 10,000 dervish infantry. It lasted perhaps 2 minutes, and was about as dangerous as 2 minutes can reasonably be. He survived. Several of his fellow officers did not. From the Sudan campaign he also produced the River War, which included a pointed criticism of Kitchener's desecration of the Mahdi's tomb. This was not the kind of remark that made a young officer popular with senior commanders. Churchill was never particularly interested in being popular with senior commanders. He was interested in being right, By 1899, he had served in 3 wars on 2 continents, published 2 books and hundreds of newspaper articles, and reached a conclusion his fellow officers had probably reached some time before him. He was not going to make a career in the army. He resigned his commission, came home, and in November sailed for South Africa to cover the Boer War for the Morning Post. On the 15th of November 1899, travelling on an armoured train near Chieveley, he was ambushed by Boer forces. The train was derailed. Under fire, Churchill helped organise the clearing of the wreckage and the evacuation of the wounded with what the officer in charge later described as the coolest courage. Then he was captured and taken to a prisoner of war camp in Pretoria. He was 25 years old and absolutely determined not to stay. On the night of the 12th of December, he climbed over the wall of the compound and disappeared into the night. What followed involved hiding in a coal mine for 3 days, travelling concealed in a goods train among bales of wool, and eventually reaching Portuguese Mozambique, from where he sailed to Durban and arrived to a hero's welcome. He returned to South Africa, participated in the eventual British advance, found the prisoner of war camp where he had been held, walked back through its gates, and with considerable satisfaction freed the prisoners still inside. He came home in the summer of 1900 as probably the most famous young man in Britain. He was 25 years old, and the 20th century had barely begun. The politician arrives, first elections and early Parliament. Winston Churchill first stood for Parliament in a by-election in Oldham in July of 1899, shortly before his departure for South Africa. He lost. This was not particularly surprising. Oldham was a working-class constituency in Lancashire. Churchill was an inexperienced candidate standing in a difficult seat, and the combination was not a recipe for triumph. He took it, by his own account, with reasonable equanimity. He took it rather less well than he let on, but that's another matter. The South African escapade transformed his public profile entirely. When he returned in the summer of 1900, he was famous in a way that a parliamentary defeat had done nothing to diminish. He undertook lecture tours of Britain and North America, speaking about his experiences in the Boer War to audiences who were extremely interested in both the war and the young man who had escaped from it with such panache. He earned enough to establish himself as financially independent, which mattered considerably given his family's restricted means. In October of 1900, a general election was called. Churchill stood again in Oldham, and this time won. He was 25 years old. He entered Parliament in November 1900 as the Conservative member for Oldham and walked into the engine room of an empire. He gave his first parliamentary speech on the 18th of February 1901, speaking for nearly an hour without notes but having memorised the speech almost word for word, calling for generous peace terms toward the Boers and striking a note of magnanimity that ran against the jingoism some of his fellow Conservatives were voicing. He sat down to respectful applause. The speech was competent. It was rather more than competent. But the manner of its delivery revealed something important. Churchill was not a natural improvisational parliamentary debater. He was a writer who spoke, meaning his speeches were written first, rehearsed thoroughly, committed to memory, and then delivered with what appeared to be spontaneity, but was the product of enormous labour. This had one practical consequence that became apparent in May of 1904 when he was in the middle of a speech, and suddenly, catastrophically, lost the thread. He dried up completely, stood for a moment in silence, and sat down in considerable distress. It was a genuine humiliation, but it produced a change in technique. From that point on, Churchill always spoke with notes, even when he appeared not to be reading from them, and with that safety net in place he performed with increasing confidence and increasing brilliance. Sometimes the disasters teach you more than the successes. Churchill was living proof of this. His political positions in his early parliamentary years were not always comfortable ones for a Conservative. He opposed his own party's Army Reform Bill, championed free trade when the Conservatives were moving toward protectionism, and made speeches that pointed in directions the Conservative leadership found distinctly inconvenient. He was developing a political sensibility that was genuinely hard to categorise. He believed in the greatness of the British Empire, but also in the rights of individuals within it. He was suspicious of large military spending on grounds that it diverted resources from social improvement, which is somewhat remarkable, given that he would later become the most ferocious advocate of military preparedness in British history. He was, in short, complicated, and complications make politicians uncomfortable. By 1904, relations with the Conservative leadership had deteriorated to the point of rupture. On the 29th of May, Winston Churchill walked from the Conservative benches to the Liberal benches and sat down beside David Lloyd George. The floor crossing electrified the chamber and produced a fury in the Conservative Party that lasted for decades. Whether it represented principled independence or shameless opportunism has been argued about ever since. The honest answer is probably that it was both. He genuinely disagreed with Conservative tariff reform policy. He also recognised that the Liberal Party was on the rising side of British politics and that his career might prosper better under different circumstances. Adults in politics rarely act from a single pure motive, and those who claim they do are usually not being entirely candid. He was distrusted by one side for having left and distrusted by the other for eventually coming back, a position that would have crushed a lesser political animal entirely. Churchill was not a lesser political animal. In the Liberal landslide of January 1906, he was elected for Manchester North West and appointed Under Secretary of State for the Colonies, his first government position. He was an excellent administrator in ways that surprised people who thought of him primarily as a rhetorician. He read papers quickly, made decisions without hesitation, and could reduce complex problems to their essentials, with a clarity that was one of his most underrated gifts. By 1908, he was in the cabinet as President of the Board of Trade, appointed by the new Prime Minister Herbert Henry Asquith. He was 33 years old. That same year he married Clementine Hosier, who was 23, beautiful, intelligent, principled, and in possession of a quality Winston spectacularly lacked, which was good judgment about people. She was entirely honest with her husband in private in ways that required considerable courage, given how much he disliked being told he was wrong. They called each other Clemmy and Cat, and Pug. They wrote each other extraordinary letters across 57 years of marriage. They were also on occasion furiously unhappy with each other, because they were both strong-willed and neither suffered in silence. But the love held. And Clementine Churchill understood her husband in ways that no one else quite managed, which was one of the most important facts of the 20th century. The politician had arrived, the marriage had been made. What came next would test both of them in ways that neither could have entirely anticipated. Crossing the floor and finding his voice. The restless years. I should say here that the title of this chapter is somewhat misleading, because there is no period of Churchill's adult life that could accurately be described as restful. The man operated at approximately twice the metabolic rate of ordinary politicians, and the years from his floor crossing in 1904 through to the beginning of the First World War in 1914 were no exception. They were, however, years of a particular kind of creative restlessness, in which Churchill was simultaneously mastering the techniques of government and developing the political philosophy, such as it was, that would carry him through the rest of his career. As a Liberal minister, Churchill embraced social reform with the same energy he brought to everything. This surprised some observers and infuriated others, particularly those Conservatives who had always suspected that his floor crossing reflected not just disagreement on free trade, but a fundamental instability of character. Conservatives who had grown up believing that the proper function of government was to govern, and the proper function of the governed was to govern themselves, found Churchill's enthusiasm for state intervention actively alarming. What Churchill believed, as best as can be determined from his speeches and writings of this period, was something like the following. The British Empire was the greatest achievement in human history. Its greatness depended on the health and vitality of its population. A population living in poverty, working in unsafe conditions, going hungry in old age, was neither healthy nor vital. Therefore the state had an obligation to address poverty, to improve conditions for workers, and to provide some protection against the miseries of old age and unemployment. This was not, in Churchill's mind, socialism. It was national efficiency. He even used that phrase, which was fashionable in Edwardian progressive circles. The empire needed strong, healthy, educated people. It was the government's job to help produce them. He worked closely in these years with David Lloyd George, the Chancellor of the Exchequer and the most brilliant politician of his generation. Lloyd George was everything Churchill was not. A man of entirely modest origins who had risen through the Welsh liberal tradition, a natural orator who could move crowds without preparation, a pragmatist of genius who could find the political path through any obstacle. Churchill and Lloyd George made an unlikely pair, and they were never entirely comfortable with each other. But they shared enough in terms of intellectual energy and social reform ambitions to be effective partners in the reform programme that defined the Asquith government. The National Insurance Act of 1911, which introduced unemployment insurance and health insurance for workers in Britain, was one of the most significant pieces of social legislation in British history. Churchill was not its primary author, that credit belongs to Lloyd George, but he was instrumental in its design and its passage, and he was energetically involved in the campaign to sell it to a sceptical public and an even more sceptical House of Lords. He was also, during these years, engaged in a series of controversies that revealed both his qualities and his flaws in sharp relief. As Home Secretary from 1910, he became involved in two incidents that generated enormous press attention and remain historically contested. The first was the siege of Sydney Street in January 1911. A gang of Latvian anarchists who had killed 3 police officers during a jewel robbery in Houndsditch were traced to a house in Sydney Street in the East End of London. The police were unable to dislodge them. Churchill, as Home Secretary, authorised the deployment of guardsmen and personally came to observe the scene, watching from the corner of the street as a building full of anarchists was surrounded by soldiers and eventually caught fire. He was photographed there, in his top hat, peering around a corner, and the photographs appeared in every newspaper. Critics accused him of reckless interference in a police matter, of grandstanding, of treating a dangerous situation as if it were a spectator sport. Churchill argued that as the minister responsible, he had every right to be present, and that his presence helped ensure the right decisions were made. Both things may have been true simultaneously, and the difficulty in disentangling them captures something real about Churchill as a political animal. He was genuinely interested in ensuring good decisions were made. He was also genuinely interested in being present when dramatic things happened. He found it almost impossible to send a representative when he could go himself. This quality, variously described as courage, showmanship, or simply the inability to stay away from anything interesting, would create problems for him throughout his career. The second incident was the industrial unrest of 1910 and 1911, when strikes in the Welsh coalfields and elsewhere led to a request from local police for military support. Churchill authorised the deployment of troops, and in subsequent mythology, this became the moment when he ordered the military to shoot down Welsh miners. This is not what happened. The soldiers were sent to maintain order and prevent violence, and there is no evidence that Churchill ordered or approved any shooting of strikers. But the myth persisted, particularly in Wales, and it became one of those historical accusations that stick regardless of the evidence, partly because Churchill was capable enough of dramatic action in other contexts that people were prepared to believe it. He moved from the Home Office in 1911 to what would become the most important office of his pre-war career. In October of that year, Asquith appointed him First Lord of the Admiralty, which is to say the political head of the Royal Navy. It was a perfect appointment for a man who had been fascinated by military affairs his entire life, who had written about naval history, who had spent years arguing that Britain needed to take its defences seriously, and who had the energy and drive to shake up an institution that had been running on its own traditions for so long that it sometimes forgot to look at what was happening in the world outside. What was happening in the world outside was the German naval build-up. Kaiser Wilhelm II's Germany had been building a high-seas fleet with the explicit intention of challenging British naval supremacy in the North Sea. This was a strategic threat of the First Order. The Royal Navy was the foundation of British security and British imperial power. If Germany could build a fleet capable of defeating the Royal Navy, the entire strategic basis on which Britain rested would be undermined. Churchill understood this clearly and immediately, and he set about modernising the Navy with a ferocity that made him enormously popular in some circles and enormously unpopular in others. He championed the transition from coal to oil as the fuel for Navy ships, a decision that required negotiating a British government stake in the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, the predecessor of BP, and that transformed naval warfare. He pushed for the development of the 15-inch gun, a weapon of unprecedented destructive power, accepting the risk of commissioning ships built around guns that had not yet been properly tested. He was willing to bet on technological innovation in ways that more cautious administrators were not. He was also not universally popular with the naval establishment. Senior admirals found him interfering, demanding, unwilling to defer to professional expertise, and inclined to voice strong opinions on technical matters about which he had no formal training. These criticisms were not entirely unfounded. Churchill had a habit of treating his own intuitions as equivalent to other people's expertise, which was sometimes justified and sometimes disastrously incorrect. The difficulty was that you could never quite tell in advance which category you were in, which made him a stimulating but occasionally alarming person to work for. By the summer of 1914, Britain was armed with the most modern and powerful navy in the world, and Europe was lurching toward a catastrophe that most of its leaders had convinced themselves they could manage. Churchill was one of the few who believed the coming crisis was real, that Germany intended to test the alliance system, and that Britain would need to be ready to fight. He was right. He usually was when the question was whether a danger was genuine. It was sometimes on the question of what to do about it that his judgment became more complicated. When the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo on the 28th of June 1914 set in motion the alliance system that would drag Europe into the First World War, Churchill was one of the ministers most actively involved in the British government's decision-making. He mobilised the fleet on his own authority, sending the warships that were assembled for exercises to their war stations, rather than dispersing them to their home ports as planned. This was a decision of some constitutional boldness. When Asquith was informed, he approved it. The fleet was ready when war came. Churchill was 39 years old in August 1914, when Britain declared war on Germany. He was by any standard one of the most prominent politicians in Britain, widely regarded as brilliant, widely regarded as unpredictable, universally acknowledged as someone who made things happen. The question of whether the things he would make happen in the next 4 years were the right things would occupy the next decade of his life and nearly end his career entirely. Gallipoli, the disaster that nearly ended everything. There are certain words in the English language that carry so much weight, so much accumulated grief and controversy and historical argument, that they function almost as a warning before you approach them. Gallipoli is one of those words. For the British, and even more for the Australians and New Zealanders whose national identities were formed in its nightmare, Gallipoli means something beyond the mere historical event. It means sacrifice without purpose. It means leadership that failed the leadee. It means the gap between the grandeur of the plan and the catastrophe of the execution. And it is Churchill's name that is most often attached to it. This attachment is not entirely wrong, but it is not entirely right either, and the truth of what happened and what Churchill's actual responsibility was is considerably more complex than the simple narrative of the ambitious politician who sent men to their deaths through arrogance and misjudgment. The Western Front by the beginning of 1915 had already settled into the trench warfare that would define the next 4 years. The German advance through Belgium had been halted at the Marne in September 1914, and by winter both sides had dug themselves into a system of trenches stretching from the English Channel to the Swiss border. Attacking these trenches was catastrophically expensive. Barbed wire, machine guns and artillery turned every offensive into a massacre, and Churchill was not alone in looking for an alternative. His version focused on the Dardanelles, the narrow strait controlling access to Constantinople and the Black Sea. Turkey had entered the war on the German side, and Churchill's logic ran as follows: force the strait, reach Constantinople, knock Turkey out of the war, change the strategic position in the east, relieve the pressure on Russia. It was a genuinely brilliant strategic concept, with real supporters in the War Council, including Lord Kitchener himself. The problem, and it was a fundamental one, was in the execution. The original plan called for a naval operation alone. The Royal Navy would force the strait by bombarding the Turkish forts. The bombardment began in February 1915, and went moderately well at first, but as the fleet moved deeper into the strait, the resistance stiffened badly. Mines proved far more dangerous than anticipated. On the 18th of March, a major attack was launched to force the strait in a single day. 3 battleships were sunk and 3 more badly damaged. The attack was called off. What should have happened next was either a clear decision to abandon the operation, or a clear decision to commit adequate ground forces to support it. What actually happened was neither. The ground forces assembling under General Ian Hamilton were committed to a landing on the Gallipoli Peninsula, not as part of a well-resourced plan, but as a kind of improvisation. And improvisations in warfare tend to produce the results you would expect. The landings on the 25th of April 1915 were carried out in part by the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, the Anzacs, on a beach known ever since as Anzac Cove. The Turkish defenders, commanded by a young officer named Mustafa Kemal, who would later found the modern Turkish state, were well prepared on ground that heavily favoured them. Narrow beaches, steep cliffs, and tangled ridges. The campaign settled into its own version of trench warfare, fought on the slopes of a Turkish peninsula, with no room to manoeuvre and no prospect of the breakthrough the plan had promised. Men died in thousands for yards of ground that were then lost again. The evacuation came in December 1915, and it was, paradoxically, the most brilliantly executed part of the entire operation. The troops were withdrawn at night in complete silence over several weeks, with the Turks entirely unaware until the last men had left. It saved the force. It was also an acknowledgement of total failure. Allied casualties exceeded 400,000. The campaign achieved nothing of its strategic objectives. Churchill had advocated for it. That much is undeniable. Whether the failure was specifically his responsibility, rather than the collective failure of the War Council, the military commanders, and the systematic under-resourcing that plagued the operation from start to finish, historians continue to argue. The honest answer is that the responsibility was widely shared, and that Churchill received a disproportionate share of the blame, partly because he was the most visible advocate, partly because the Conservatives who had never forgiven him for crossing the floor in 1904 were delighted to have a reason to demand his removal. He was removed from the Admiralty and offered the position of Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, which sounds impressive and involves almost nothing. He spent months attending cabinet meetings as an observer, watching decisions he had no power to influence, in a state of misery that Clementine later described as the most dangerous period of his life. He then did something that, even for Churchill, was startling. He went to France and took command of a battalion on the Western Front. He was 41 years old. He led his men with close attention to detail and complete disregard for his own safety, walking trenches when he should not have been walking them, taking risks that made his subordinates nervous. He was not a great battalion commander exactly. He was a genuinely good one, which is considerably more than most politicians who visited the front could say. He bore the weight of Gallipoli without entirely hiding from it. He argued his case, secured the publication of the relevant documents, demonstrated that the responsibility was more widely distributed than his critics admitted. But he never quite absolved himself entirely, and that quality, the willingness to carry the weight rather than simply place it elsewhere, is part of what makes him more complicated and more admirable than the mythology in either direction tends to suggest. Gallipoli had taken something from him, but the testing, as testing does, had also given something back. A certain understanding of the gap between a plan and its execution, of the friction that reality always applies to the clarity of ideas. He would apply that understanding later, in circumstances where it mattered infinitely more. But first came the wilderness years, exile, painting, and warnings. Nobody heard. There is a period in Winston Churchill's life referred to, almost universally, as the wilderness years. It stretches from 1931, when he resigned from the Conservative front bench over Indian independence, to 1939, when the outbreak of the Second World War made his return to government effectively inevitable. The word wilderness implies emptiness, and these years were anything but empty. Before we reach the wilderness properly, there is a decade of extraordinary activity to account for. Churchill returned to government in 1917 when Lloyd George brought him back as Minister of Munitions, a remarkable rehabilitation for a man whose reputation had apparently been destroyed at Gallipoli. He threw himself into the role with characteristic energy, championing the development of the tank, which he had recognised as a mechanical solution to the problem of barbed wire and machine guns that was killing men by the hundreds of thousands. After the armistice, he served as Secretary of State for War and Air, then as Colonial Secretary, dealing with the chaotic aftermath of the First World War in the Middle East. He chaired the conference in Cairo in 1921 that established the boundaries of the modern Middle Eastern states, drawing lines on maps whose consequences, as we now know, extended rather far into the future. He then switched parties again, from Liberal back to Conservative, with less drama than the original crossing of the floor but no less commentary from his critics, and was appointed Chancellor of the Exchequer by Stanley Baldwin in 1924. He described himself as never having understood currency and credit, which was, it must be said, somewhat apparent. His decision to return Britain to the gold standard in 1925 at the pre-war parity is regarded by most economic historians as a serious mistake. He later called it the biggest mistake of his life, which is a significant admission from a man who had Gallipoli on his record and suggests either extraordinary self-awareness or a remarkable capacity for reordering the hierarchy of his own errors, possibly both. He left the Treasury when Baldwin's government lost in 1929, and in 1931 resigned from the shadow cabinet over Indian independence. He was wrong about India. He was genuinely and passionately wrong, convinced that India was not ready for self-government in a way that reflected the deepest assumptions of his Victorian imperial upbringing. And the vigour with which he expressed this wrongness damaged his credibility significantly on the matters where he was entirely right. This is one of the structural tragedies of Churchill's 1930s. His warnings about Hitler and German rearmament were correct, urgent and specific. But his simultaneous positions on India allowed his critics to dismiss him as simply a reactionary who saw danger everywhere, a man of a previous era who had never quite understood that the world had changed. Because he was right about Germany and wrong about India, he occupied an uncomfortable middle position that made it easy to ignore the right while citing the wrong. He watched the remilitarization of the Rhineland go unanswered. He watched the Anschluss with Austria go unanswered. He watched Munich in September 1938 with a horror he expressed in Parliament with devastating clarity. While other politicians congratulated Chamberlain on preserving peace, Churchill stood up and told the House they had been given the choice between war and dishonour, that they had chosen dishonour and that they would have war. He was correct on all counts and almost completely isolated. During these years he wrote constantly, producing his 4-volume biography of the Duke of Marlborough, which is partly biography and partly a meditation on leadership in existential crisis, a subject occupying his mind for reasons that had nothing to do with the 17th century. He painted, having discovered it in 1915 at the lowest point of his Gallipoli despair, finding in it a form of absorption so complete it silenced the interior noise. And he built an informal intelligence network of civil servants and ministry officials sufficiently alarmed by German rearmament to channel information to the one politician who seemed genuinely interested in receiving it. He warned and warned and warned. And for most of the decade he was treated as a figure of slightly embarrassing excess. Then Germany invaded Poland on the 1st of September 1939, and Neville Chamberlain telephoned. The signal sent to the fleet that day was 3 words: Winston is back. The wilderness years were over. What came next was the reason they had mattered: the gathering storm, Churchill and the rise of Hitler. When Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany on the 30th of January 1933, Winston Churchill had already been warning about the dangers of German resurgence for several years. He had watched the Weimar Republic struggle, had observed the growth of the Nazi Party with alarm, and had argued in Parliament and in his journalism that the Treaty of Versailles, while severe, was less important than the question of what kind of nation Germany was becoming and what it intended to do with its reviving power. This needs a moment of historical honesty, because it's easy to present Churchill in this period as a lone prophet crying truth in the wilderness. And while that is substantially correct, it requires some qualification. Churchill in the early 1930s was not always right about everything. He was right about Germany. He was deeply wrong about India. He was wrong about the abdication crisis of 1936, when he championed King Edward VIII's right to marry Wallis Simpson, and nearly destroyed his own credibility in the process by appearing to work against the constitutional settlement. He was wrong about the Irish Treaty. He was wrong about the gold standard. What Churchill had in the 1930s was not general infallibility. He had specific clarity about one particular danger, and that danger was Adolf Hitler and the regime he was constructing in Germany. Churchill's understanding of Hitler came from several sources. He read German newspapers and had them translated. He received reports from his network of unofficial informants within the British government. He had met, through various social connections, people who had observed the early Nazi movement at close quarters. He read Hitler's own words, notably Mein Kampf, with the seriousness they deserved, and that many of his contemporaries, finding them too extreme to take entirely literally, failed to apply. He wrote about Hitler in his newspaper columns in 1935 with a characteristic mixture of vivid description and analytical precision. He described a man of genius and ferocity, a man who had risen from poverty and obscurity to command the most powerful state in continental Europe, and a man whose declared intentions, if taken seriously, amounted to a program for European domination and racial extermination. He took them seriously. Most of the political establishment in Britain preferred a more optimistic reading. The policy of appeasement, which is the name given to the British government's approach to Germany through most of the 1930s, was not simply a failure of nerve. It was a coherent, if ultimately disastrous, strategic calculation. Its advocates, primarily Neville Chamberlain and the Foreign Office, believed several things. They believed that Germany had genuine grievances arising from the Treaty of Versailles, and that addressing some of these grievances would remove the fuel from the Nazi engine. They believed that Britain was not yet in a position to fight Germany, and that time spent in negotiation was time spent rearming. They believed that war was so catastrophic, particularly given what the generation of 1914 to 18 had experienced, that almost any accommodation was preferable to it, Churchill understood the horror of war as well as anyone in British politics. He had been in the trenches. He had lost friends in every conflict of his adult life. He did not want war. What he argued, with a clarity that his opponents could not dislodge, was that appeasement was not producing peace. It was producing a more powerful Germany, emboldened by each concession, more certain that the democracies lacked the will to resist, more prepared for the war that Hitler had never concealed his intention of fighting. His speech after Munich in October 1938 is worth dwelling on, because it encapsulates the argument at its most powerful. He did not simply attack the agreement. He analysed it. He showed, line by line, what had been surrendered and what had been received in return. He pointed out that Czechoslovakia, which had been the most stable democracy in Central Europe, and which had possessed the fortifications and the military capacity to make a German attack expensive, had been dissolved without firing a shot, not because it could not fight, but because it had been told by its allies that they would not support it if it did. He pointed out that Germany was now significantly stronger than it had been before Munich, and that Britain was significantly weaker. He pointed out that Hitler had promised repeatedly that each territorial acquisition was his last, and had then made another. He delivered this analysis in a House of Commons that was, for the most part, not interested in hearing it. The relief of the agreement was too recent, the desire for peace too powerful, the political investment of the Chamberlain government in the Munich deal too great. He was cheered eventually by a small portion of the House and greeted with hostility by the rest. He was right. 6 months later, in March of 1939, Germany occupied the remainder of Czechoslovakia, the part that had not been surrendered at Munich. This violated the terms of the Munich Agreement itself. It demonstrated beyond any reasonable doubt that Hitler's promises meant nothing, and that appeasement was not working. Chamberlain, to his credit, drew the conclusion and changed policy, extending guarantees to Poland and accelerating British rearmament. But the years of appeasement had had their cost. Germany had rearmed more completely than Britain had managed. The Luftwaffe was powerful and modern. The German army was equipped and experienced. The strategic position that might have been favourable in 1936, when France and Britain together could have confronted Germany before she was fully armed, had been lost. Churchill had said this would happen. He had said it clearly and repeatedly. Nobody particularly wanted to hear it. He also observed during the 1930s the other totalitarian power whose intentions would matter enormously. He had been viscerally anti-communist from the Russian Revolution of 1917 onward, calling for Western intervention to support the anti-Bolshevik forces in the Russian Civil War with an enthusiasm that was not universally shared in the cabinet of the time. His hostility to Soviet communism was genuine and deep, rooted in his belief that the Bolshevik Revolution represented not a genuine workers' movement, but a seizure of power by a ruthless minority that would produce tyranny rather than liberation. This hostility would create complications when the Nazi-Soviet Pact of August 1939 revealed that Stalin was prepared to cooperate with Hitler, and even greater complications when Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, and Churchill was suddenly required to welcome Stalin as an ally. He managed the transition with a pragmatism that was genuinely impressive, saying simply that if Hitler invaded hell, he would at least make a favourable reference to the devil in the House of Commons. Throughout the 1930s, Churchill was also conducting, in his published writing, a kind of extended argument with the spirit of the age. The great contemporaries of 1937 gathered his profiles of the most significant figures of the time. His newspaper columns reached millions of readers across Britain and America. His speeches were reported in detail. He was not invisible or silent. He was extremely loud and extremely visible. The problem was that the message he was delivering was one that the 1930s, still nursing the wounds of the previous war, did not want to receive. He was also, privately, in some of the most painful periods of his psychological life. He suffered from what he called his black dog, a depression that descended without warning and could leave him unable to work for days at a time, staring into a fire or walking the grounds of Chartwell, his country house in Kent, in a state of grey paralysis. He never, as far as can be determined, sought medical help for this in any systematic way. He managed it by working, by painting, by keeping himself too busy most of the time for the darkness to find purchase. But it found it sometimes, and the 1930s, with their accumulating frustrations and their sense of watching a catastrophe approach, while being powerless to prevent it, were years when it found it more than most. Chartwell deserves a moment. Churchill had bought it in 1922, against Clementine's advice, because he fell in love with it on first sight. It is a medium-sized house on the Greensand Ridge in Kent, with views south across the Weald that on clear days reach to the English Channel. He spent the interwar years transforming the grounds, building walls with his own hands, creating a swimming pool and a series of ornamental ponds, adding rooms and terraces. The house became one of the great expressions of his personality, an accumulation of his enthusiasms, his books, his paintings, his papers, his family, all collected together in a place that was specifically and unmistakably his. He was happy at Chartwell, or as happy as he was capable of being in the difficult years. His children grew up there, his grandchildren would know it. He entertained there, bringing politicians, writers, military men, and assorted interesting people to the large dining table where he held court, and which served de facto as one of the informal political arenas of the period. The conversations at Chartwell in the 1930s, documented in the diaries and letters of those who attended them, were among the most serious discussions of the European crisis happening anywhere in Britain. When the war came in September 1939, Churchill left Chartwell and went back to Whitehall. He would not see the house again for a very long time. 10 days in May, how Churchill became Prime Minister. In the 8 months between September 1939, when Britain declared war on Germany, and May 1940, when the real test began, Churchill was back in his old office at the Admiralty, conducting the naval war with the energy and the interference that had characterised his previous tenure there. He was productive and difficult in roughly equal measure, the two qualities that seemed to have been inseparable in him. The phony war, as that strange period of declared but largely inactive conflict came to be called, was not entirely phony at sea. German submarines were attacking merchant shipping from the first day of the war. The Navy was engaged in the constant, dangerous, largely invisible work of convoy protection and the hunt for German surface raiders. Churchill was involved in every aspect of this, demanding daily briefings, sending memoranda to everyone involved, proposing operations and plans with a frequency that kept his staff in a perpetual state of productive exhaustion. He also proposed and championed an operation that went, from the British perspective, rather badly. The Norwegian campaign of April 1940 was intended to forestall a German occupation of Norway by landing British forces there first. The intention was sound. The execution was poor. German forces moved faster than anticipated. British plans were delayed and confused, and the campaign ended in a British withdrawal that, while it produced some individual acts of considerable bravery, was a failure in strategic terms. This is worth noting because it created a political paradox of considerable significance. The Norwegian failure was, to a considerable degree, the result of decisions for which Churchill bore responsibility as the minister most directly involved in planning the naval side of the operation. It was also the event that led directly to the political crisis that made Churchill Prime Minister. The failure of Norway discredited the Chamberlain government and produced the parliamentary debate that ended with Chamberlain's resignation. Churchill was the beneficiary of a political storm that he had, in part, contributed to creating. History has a complicated sense of humour. The Norway debate took place on the 7th and 8th of May 1940. It was one of the most dramatic parliamentary debates of the century. Leo Amery, a senior Conservative politician, delivered a speech in which he quoted Oliver Cromwell's words to the Long Parliament, directly at Chamberlain's government. "In the name of God, go." David Lloyd George spoke with devastating force. The government won the division, but by a margin so reduced that the political damage was fatal. Chamberlain attempted, in the days that followed, to form a national coalition government that would include the Labour Party. Labour's leaders, Clement Attlee and Arthur Greenwood, made it clear that they would serve in a coalition government, but not under Chamberlain. The question became who should replace him. There were two candidates. Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, was the establishment choice. He was respected, calm, aristocratic, experienced, and considered by most of the Conservative Party to be a safer and more predictable figure than Churchill. He was also a Viscount, which meant that as a member of the House of Lords he could not effectively lead the government in the House of Commons, a practical objection that mattered somewhat. More importantly, on closer inspection, Halifax did not want the job. In conversations at this critical moment, Halifax expressed to Churchill his conviction that his position as a peer would make it impossible to lead the country in war, and that Churchill should therefore be Prime Minister. It is one of history's most consequential acts of apparent self-effacement. Whether Halifax genuinely believed this, or whether he was simply a shrewd enough politician to recognise that the coming months would be appalling, and that he would rather not bear primary responsibility for them, is a question that historians have debated at length. The result was the same either way. On the afternoon of the 10th of May 1940, Churchill was summoned to Buckingham Palace. The meeting with King George VI was brief. The king was not, at this point, entirely enthusiastic about Churchill. He would have preferred Halifax. He invited Churchill to form a government. Churchill said he would. He drove back to the Admiralty. He later described the feeling of that evening, the sense that at last he was walking with destiny, that his entire preparation had been for this moment. He was not a man who expressed doubt, or not in public, and his memoir of the Second World War presents this moment with magnificent confidence. In private, the picture was more complicated. He knew what he was facing. He knew that France was already under German attack, and that the situation was desperate. He went to bed at 3 a.m, which for Churchill was actually rather early, and slept the sleep of a man who was perhaps too clear-eyed about the magnitude of his task to be anxious about it in the ordinary way. He had been right about Germany for a decade. He had spent that decade preparing himself, intellectually and emotionally, for this moment. He was ready. What he was not ready for, because nobody could have been, was how quickly and how completely the situation would collapse. Germany had invaded France and the Low Countries on the 10th of May, the same day Churchill became Prime Minister. The German offensive was not the frontal assault through Belgium that the Allied commanders had anticipated and planned for. It was a thrust through the Ardennes, the forested region that the French had considered impassable to armoured forces, that cut behind the Allied armies in Belgium and drove toward the Channel. Within days, the strategic situation was catastrophic. Churchill's first great speech as Prime Minister, delivered to the House of Commons on the 13th of May 1940, contains the phrase that perhaps more than any other defines his wartime leadership. I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. It is worth pausing on this for a moment, because it is so different from what politicians ordinarily say. Politicians, facing crisis, typically promise that the crisis will be managed, that the situation is less alarming than it appears, that their particular combination of experience and policy is equal to the challenge. Churchill told the truth. He told the House of Commons, and through them the British people, that what was coming was going to be terrible, that he had nothing to offer but the most demanding forms of human effort, and that the only policy was victory, because without victory there was no survival. He told the truth, and he framed the truth in language of such power that it became itself a form of inspiration. This is the essential Churchill gift. Not false optimism, not the management of expectations, but the honest description of a terrible situation in terms that made bearing it feel not only possible but necessary. He made the truth into something you could hold on to. His war cabinet was formed from across party lines. Clement Attlee and Arthur Greenwood of the Labour Party joined alongside the Conservatives. This was both politically necessary and genuinely useful. Labour provided a connection to the working-class population, whose support and whose labour would be essential to the war effort, and whose leaders were, in several cases, considerably more competent administrators than Churchill's Conservative colleagues. He also retained Halifax in the War Cabinet initially, which he later described as the most dangerous of all the difficult decisions of his first months in office. Their finest hour, the summer Britain stood alone. The summer of 1940 is one of the most remarkable periods in modern history, and it is remarkable not primarily because of the battles that were fought, though those were remarkable enough, but because of what was decided in a series of meetings and conversations and speeches and silences about what Britain would do and what Britain would be. France fell. Let us be clear about that, and about the scale of it. France, which had the largest army in Western Europe, which had been fighting Germany since 1914 with enormous sacrifices, and had eventually prevailed, France collapsed in 6 weeks. The speed and completeness of the German victory in France was one of the most shocking events in modern military history. The French army, though large, was outmanoeuvred by a German plan of extraordinary boldness and executed with extraordinary speed. The British Expeditionary Force in France was cut off from the main French forces and driven to the coast. The evacuation from Dunkirk between the 26th of May and the 4th of June 1940 saved over 300,000 Allied soldiers from the beaches of northern France. Churchill famously observed that wars are not won by evacuations, and he was right. Dunkirk was a survival, not a triumph. The equipment of the British Expeditionary Force, its tanks, artillery, vehicles, and weapons, was left on the beaches of France. What returned to Britain was the men, their lives, and their experience, and these were not nothing. but the strategic situation was desperate. France requested an armistice and France received one. On the 22nd of June 1940, France formally ceased to fight Germany. Britain was alone. Alone is a peculiar word in this context, because Britain had its empire and those Commonwealth countries, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa and others, remained in the fight. It had the Royal Navy, still the most powerful in the world. It had the RAF, which had been modernising for several years. It had the English Channel. It was not literally alone. But it was without any continental ally, facing a Germany that had conquered most of Europe in less than a year and was now master of the Atlantic coast from Norway to the Spanish border. Whether this constituted aloneness or not depends somewhat on your definitions, but it certainly constituted an extremely serious situation. Within the War Cabinet in the last days of May, a debate was held that only came to light decades later when the Cabinet papers were finally released. It is one of the most important debates in British history. The question was whether Britain should explore the possibility of a negotiated peace with Germany, using Mussolini's Italy as an intermediary. Lord Halifax raised the question. He was not, in doing this, necessarily arguing for surrender. He was arguing for the exploration of whether peace terms were available that were not incompatible with British independence. There is a distinction, not always observed in subsequent historical discussion, between exploring terms and surrendering. Halifax believed it was his duty to at least raise the question. Churchill opposed it. He opposed it with force, but he also opposed it with considerable political skill, because he was aware that Halifax commanded significant support within the War Cabinet and the Conservative Party, and that a direct confrontation on the question might not go in his favour. He argued that no terms Germany offered at this moment could be trusted, that Hitler had broken every agreement he had made, that any negotiation begun from weakness would end in capitulation rather than accommodation, and that if Britain began peace feelers and they became known, as they inevitably would, the effect on British morale and on American opinion would be devastating. He won the argument, but he won it through persuasion rather than dictation, through the force of his case rather than the authority of his position. He gathered the larger cabinet, the 25 ministers below War Cabinet level, and spoke to them with a directness and an emotional force that was, by the accounts of those present, overwhelming. He told them the situation, told them what giving up would mean, told them that he believed Britain could and would fight on, and that whatever happened to him personally he would never give up. The response was, by all accounts, emotional and unanimous. There would be no peace feelers. This moment, which had no audience except the cabinet ministers who were there, is in some respects the most important moment of Churchill's life, because it was here, in a room with no public, no press, no gallery, that the decision was taken that determined the course of the war and possibly the course of the century. If Britain had sought terms in late May or early June of 1940, the terms available would have been terms of German dominance. The United States would have faced a Europe entirely controlled by Hitler. The Soviet Union, whatever its other qualities, would have faced the full weight of German military power without the distraction of a Western front. The outcome of such a rearranged world is impossible to calculate with certainty, but it is difficult to imagine it resembling the world we actually inhabit. Churchill's decision was not the decision of a man who did not understand the risks. He understood them perfectly. He was 65 years old. He had seen what modern war looked like. He had been in Parliament through the 1930s and had watched the casualty list from the First World War fill the notice boards of every village in England. He knew what he was asking of the country. He asked it anyway because he had also calculated with the cold strategic eye that coexisted in him with the rhetorical fire that the alternative was worse. He said this publicly on the 18th of June 1940 in what became known as the finest hour speech, delivered first to the House of Commons and then broadcast to the nation. He described the situation with complete honesty. France had fallen. Britain stood alone. The Battle of Britain was about to begin. And then he said the thing that transformed a description of catastrophe into a call to endurance. Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duties, and so bear ourselves that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour. The phrase is so famous that it is almost impossible to hear it fresh. But try, for a moment, to hear it as people heard it in June of 1940, when the news was nothing but bad, when the prospect of German invasion was real and imminent, when there was no particular rational basis for confidence that things would come right. In that context, the phrase is not propaganda. It is a challenge. It is an invitation to be the kind of people that the moment required. It is, in the truest sense, an act of leadership. Churchill understood something about human beings that not all leaders understand. That people generally rise to what is asked of them. That the honest description of a challenge, combined with a genuine belief in the capacity to meet it, is more effective than false reassurance. He did not tell the British people it would be easy. He told them it would be hard and that they were capable of bearing it. They were. The Battle of Britain, fought from the summer through the autumn of 1940, was the campaign in which the Luftwaffe attempted to destroy the Royal Air Force and establish the air superiority that would be necessary for a German invasion of Britain. It was a battle fought primarily by young men in Spitfires and Hurricanes against Messerschmitts and Dorniers and Heinkels, over the fields and towns of southern England, with contrails crossing the summer sky. Churchill watched and directed and inspired with characteristic energy. He visited Fighter Command headquarters, watching the operations table that showed the position of every squadron. He spoke of the young pilots, the few to whom so much was owed by so many. He walked through bombed areas of London and the southeast, appearing in his distinctive boiler suit and hat, making the V for Victory sign, talking to people who had lost their homes and their neighbours, providing by his very presence a kind of guarantee that the country still existed and still intended to resist. His relationship with his own emotions was interesting in these periods of maximum crisis. He cried. He cried quite often, at moments of sacrifice and courage and grief, and he cried in public without embarrassment. This was not considered a weakness by the people who observed it. It was considered, and rightly, evidence that he actually felt what he was saying, and that the rhetoric came from a genuine place. A man who can describe courage and weep at it is not performing. He is testifying. The RAF held. The Battle of Britain was won, if won is quite the right word for what was essentially a defensive success, in September and October of 1940. The German invasion, Operation Sea Lion, was postponed indefinitely. The aerial assault shifted from the RAF's airfields to British cities in the campaign known as the Blitz, the logic being that if Germany could not destroy the RAF through direct combat, it would break civilian morale through urban bombing. It would turn out that this logic was wrong about British civilians in precisely the same way that similar logic would be wrong about German civilians in the later years of the war. Bombing civilians does not generally break their morale. It tends to harden it. This was not well understood by either side at the beginning of the Second World War. It became much better understood by the end. Churchill spent the Blitz doing what he had done during the Battle of Britain, visiting, appearing, being seen, providing through his physical presence in damaged streets and bombed districts a kind of moral ballast. He was not comfortable sitting in headquarters while people suffered. He needed to see. He needed to be there. This quality, which had irritated senior officers when he was a young man, and which had made things occasionally chaotic during the Norway campaign, was now one of his greatest assets. The people of Britain saw their Prime Minister among them during the worst of it, and it mattered. He was also, during these months, managing an enormous weight of strategic, diplomatic and administrative work. He was dealing with Roosevelt's America, the most important relationship of the entire war. He was dealing with the Free French under General de Gaulle, a relationship that tested his patience more completely than almost any other in his life. He was dealing with the Commonwealth countries. He was managing the service chiefs, the supply ministries, the intelligence services, the production of weapons, the allocation of shipping. He was working 18-hour days regularly, and 16 hours on the days when the workload was somewhat lighter. And in all of this, he was sustained, substantially, by Clementine, who managed his domestic life, who wrote him letters of such clarity and honesty that they sometimes made him furious and occasionally changed his mind, who told him when he was being wrong, and who told him when he was being right with equal force. Their partnership in these years was one of the less celebrated but more important facts of the Second World War. Their finest hour. The phrase is Churchill's, but what it named was larger than any speech. It named a period of human behaviour that stands, even now, as evidence of what people are capable of when they are asked honestly, and led with conviction. It was not without its shadows, its failures, its injustices, its moments when the leadership fell short of the aspiration. But the aspiration itself was real, and the response it called forth was real, and the outcome was real. The summer of 1940 was when the war was saved, not won. Saving and winning are different. But in the summer of 1940, the possibility of winning was preserved, and in that preservation, everything that followed became possible. The Blitz. When London burned and did not break. The Blitz began on the 7th of September 1940 and lasted in its initial intensive phase until May of 1941. During those 8 months, German bombers attacked British cities on 57 consecutive nights in London alone, dropping tens of thousands of bombs on a city that had never expected to be a battlefield and that responded to the experience with a mixture of genuine suffering, remarkable solidarity, and the particular kind of dry humour that the English have traditionally deployed against adversity. Churchill was deeply involved in the Blitz experience, but he was involved in a way that was characteristically both strategic and personal. Strategically, he had to make decisions about how to respond, about the allocation of anti-aircraft guns and searchlights and barrage balloons, about the balance between defending cities and maintaining the offensive capacity of bomber command, about the question of how to communicate with a civilian population that was being bombed on a nightly basis without providing useful information to the enemy. Personally, he needed to see it. He needed to visit the bombed areas, to speak with the people who were suffering, to walk through the ruins with his cigar and his hat and his immovable expression of determination. He did this constantly, more often than his security staff would have liked, and more often than Clementine worried was wise. He was 65 years old, he was the Prime Minister, and he walked through districts that were still on fire. The accounts of people who saw him in these visits are consistent and remarkable. They describe a man who was clearly genuinely moved, who cried openly at what he saw, who talked to people in the ruins of their homes with attention and warmth, but who also projected without apparent effort a quality that made people feel that this was not the end, that it was terrible and it was real and it would end, and that England would still be standing when it did. He was not performing for them. He was with them. And the distinction, which people can always sense even when they cannot name it, mattered enormously. There is a story, possibly apocryphal but too perfectly illustrative to omit, of Churchill visiting a bombed area in the East End of London where a crowd gathered around him, and a woman called out that it was good of him to come and see them, and Churchill, with tears on his cheek, said, "I am not seeing you. I am seeing history." I am not sure how accurate the quotation is, but whether he said it or not, it captures something true. He was deeply moved by ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances, and that genuine emotion was visible and was part of what made him effective. The Blitz killed around 43,000 civilians in Britain, a number that is large enough to represent enormous individual tragedy, and small enough, in the terrible arithmetic of the Second World War, to have failed to achieve its strategic objective. The German calculation had been that sustained bombing would break civilian morale and produce pressure for peace. This calculation was wrong. British morale bent under the bombing. It did not break. People endured, rebuilt, maintained the routines of daily life with a stubbornness that was not simply propaganda, but was a genuine social response to shared threat. Churchill understood this stubbornness and appealed to it. He understood it because he was himself a person of enormous personal stubbornness who had, over a lifetime, confused stubbornness with virtue, and found, to his surprise, that in this particular context he appeared to have been right. A leader who tells a stubborn people to be stubborn in a stubborn cause is pushing against an open door. Churchill was very good at pushing against open doors. He was also, during the Blitz months, dealing with the most pressing strategic question of the entire war, the attitude of the United States. Franklin Roosevelt's America was, in 1940 and 1941, officially neutral. The American public, traumatized by the First World War and sustained by an ocean of separating geography, was broadly opposed to involvement in another European conflict. Roosevelt understood the strategic importance of Britain's survival better than most of his public and was doing what he could, within political constraints, to help. The Destroyers for Bases Agreement of September 1940 gave Britain 50 old American destroyers in exchange for 99-year leases on several British naval bases. Lend-Lease, proposed in late 1940 and passed by Congress in March of 1941, provided a mechanism for supplying Britain with arms and materials without requiring immediate payment. Churchill's management of the relationship with Roosevelt was one of the great diplomatic achievements of the war. He had been communicating with Roosevelt since before he became Prime Minister, and the correspondence between them, when it was eventually published, revealed a friendship of remarkable warmth and mutual respect. They were very different men. Roosevelt was charming, mercurial, politically cautious, with a politician's instinct for never quite committing to more than he needed to. Churchill was direct, emotionally open, strategically bold, and constitutionally incapable of the kind of studied ambiguity that Roosevelt deployed so effectively. They liked each other enormously and infuriated each other with some regularity, which is perhaps the most reliable foundation for a durable alliance. Churchill wrote to Roosevelt during the Blitz with the kind of directness that he brought to everything. He described what was happening, described what Britain needed, described his belief that with American support Britain could prevail, and that without it the situation was far more difficult. He was not begging. He was being honest. He told Roosevelt what he needed to hear even when it was uncomfortable. This was, in the end, more effective than diplomatic courtesy would have been, because Roosevelt recognized someone who was telling him the truth, and truth was not always the most abundant commodity in the diplomatic communications of the period. On the home front, Churchill's wartime government was far more a collective enterprise than the public image of the lone war leader suggests. He was the undisputed head of government and the voice of the nation, but the day-to-day administration of the war effort relied on colleagues whose competence was genuine and whose independence he respected within limits. Ernest Bevin, the Minister of Labour, was a trade union leader of enormous practical ability who mobilised the British workforce for war production with a combination of legal authority and personal authority that was impressive in both its scale and its effectiveness. Clement Attlee, the Deputy Prime Minister, ran the domestic side of the government with a quiet efficiency that freed Churchill to concentrate on strategy and the grand direction of the war. Churchill himself was not an easy boss. He was brilliant, demanding, changeable, capable of pursuing ideas with great force one day and abandoning them the next, requiring answers to questions at 3 a.m. with apparently no awareness that other people might be sleeping. He dictated memoranda in the bath, in his car, in bed, at dinner tables. He expected immediate responses to his communications. He could be savage in his criticism, and then entirely forget the savagery by the next meeting, which his subordinates found difficult to manage with. But he was also, and this is less often noted, genuinely capable of being wrong and changing his mind when presented with compelling evidence. His relationship with his chiefs of staff, the military commanders who provided professional advice on the conduct of the war, was difficult and productive in roughly equal measure. He was convinced, from Gallipoli and from the trenches, that civilian oversight of military strategy was not only legitimate but necessary, that generals were not automatically right and politicians not automatically wrong. The chiefs, particularly General Alan Brooke, who became Chief of the Imperial General Staff in December of 1941, and who has left us an invaluable diary of his relationship with Churchill, found him exhausting, maddening, occasionally brilliant, and ultimately irreplaceable. Brooke's diary entries about Churchill are among the most revealing documents of the war. He records the frustrations with great candour, but he also records repeatedly that Churchill's instinct for the essential question, his ability to cut through complexity to the core of a strategic problem, and his sheer force of will were the qualities that held the alliance together in its darkest moments. They needed each other, and both of them knew it. The Blitz ended formally in May of 1941 when the Luftwaffe was redeployed eastward in preparation for the invasion of the Soviet Union. London, Coventry, Plymouth, Birmingham, Liverpool, Bristol, and many other British cities bore the scars of what had happened, but they were still standing. The people who lived in them were still fighting. The RAF was intact. The Royal Navy was at sea. The army was rebuilding. Britain had not been broken. Hitler had committed himself to a two-front war without having resolved the Western Front, a strategic mistake of the First Order. And Churchill, exhausted but unwavering, turned his attention to the next phase of a war that was about to change its character entirely. The Grand Alliance, Churchill, Roosevelt and Stalin, the shape of the Second World War changed completely on 2 dates in 1941. The first was the 22nd of June, when Germany invaded the Soviet Union in Operation Barbarossa, the largest military operation in history. The second was the 7th of December, when Japan attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, and the United States entered the war. These 2 events transformed what had been, from Britain's perspective, a survival fight against overwhelming odds into a global conflict in which the democratic world had allies of sufficient power to make ultimate victory genuinely conceivable. Churchill's reactions to both events are worth noting. When the news of the German invasion of the Soviet Union reached him, Churchill was at Chequers, the Prime Minister's official country residence. He had been told of it the previous night and had slept on it, as was his habit. The next day, he delivered a radio broadcast in which he declared that any man or state who fights against Nazism will have our aid. This was a remarkable statement for a man who had spent decades as one of the most prominent anti-communist voices in British public life. He was not abandoning his analysis of Soviet communism. He was applying a more important principle, that there was only one enemy that mattered at that moment, and that any force willing to fight that enemy was, for the duration, an ally. He made this point privately with his characteristic wit. He said that if Hitler invaded hell, he would at least make a favourable reference to the devil in the House of Commons. This line is so good that it has been attributed to him rather than invented afterward, which is usually the reliable test of whether Churchill actually said something, or whether he has been given credit for the wit of others. The alliance with the Soviet Union was real but deeply uncomfortable. Churchill had genuine and non-trivial concerns about Soviet intentions, concerns that would prove entirely justified in the post-war period. Stalin was not a reliable ally in the sense of someone whose commitments you could trust. He was a reliable ally in the sense of someone who was fighting Germany with enormous resources and causing Germany enormous losses, which was, in the circumstances, the essential requirement. Churchill made several journeys to Moscow during the war, meetings with Stalin that are documented in his own memoir and in the records of those who attended them. They were not comfortable meetings. Stalin was difficult, suspicious, and fond of making demands that went beyond what Britain could reasonably provide. He wanted a second front in Western Europe, to relieve the pressure on the Soviet Union consistently from 1941 onward. Churchill had to explain repeatedly that Britain was not in a position to launch a cross-channel invasion before the conditions for its success existed. Stalin found these explanations unsatisfying, which was understandable given that the Soviet Union was absorbing casualties in numbers that no Western country was remotely approaching. Churchill's relationship with Stalin was one of the most psychologically complex of his life. He respected Stalin's toughness, his intelligence, and his ability to command a country of continental scale in extremis. He was also fully aware that Stalin was a tyrant responsible for the deaths of millions of his own people. He managed this relationship with a pragmatism that cost him something, because he was asking his country and the world to ally with a man whose methods were incompatible with everything he claimed to be fighting for. He justified it, correctly, on the grounds that defeating Hitler was an overriding necessity and that an imperfect ally in that cause was better than none. He was right, but the justification does not entirely erase the discomfort. When Pearl Harbor occurred and America entered the war, Churchill's reaction was, by his own account, one of profound relief. He described going to bed that night and sleeping the sleep of the saved and thankful. This is not an exaggeration. He had been trying for a year and a half to bring the United States into the war. He had known that without American power in the long run the war would be extremely difficult to win. He had nurtured the relationship with Roosevelt through the long period of American neutrality with patience and skill, and now, through no action of his own but through Japan's catastrophic strategic misjudgment in attacking America, the barrier had fallen. He travelled to Washington within weeks, spending Christmas of 1941 in the White House as Roosevelt's guest. He addressed a joint session of Congress with a speech that drew on all his rhetorical gifts, and was received with the kind of enthusiasm that suggested he had, in some fundamental way, understood the American audience and its values. He made references to his American mother and to the common heritage of the English-speaking peoples with a sincerity that was genuine, because he had always felt this kinship, and an effectiveness that confirmed why he was doing the speech himself rather than delegating it. The Grand Alliance, the three-way partnership of Britain, the United States and the Soviet Union against the Axis powers, was never particularly harmonious. The three powers had different strategic interests, different political systems, different views about what the post-war world should look like, and a substantial amount of mutual suspicion. Churchill was the most experienced of the three leaders in the traditional sense of having navigated complex diplomatic relationships over decades, but he was also the weakest in terms of material power. Britain was the junior partner to America in terms of industrial output, population, and potential military strength, even if in 1941 the British had been fighting for longer and had developed a professional military experience that the Americans had yet to acquire. Churchill's management of the alliance, particularly with the Americans, is one of the great diplomatic achievements of the war, but it was also the source of what he experienced as some of his most painful frustrations. The Americans had a strongly held view, expressed by their senior commander George Marshall and by Roosevelt's other military advisors, that the war should be won by the most direct route possible, which was to say by building up forces in Britain and launching a cross-channel invasion of France as soon as practicable. Churchill consistently argued for a more indirect approach, for operations in North Africa, in the Mediterranean, in Italy, that would wear down German strength and improve the conditions for the eventual invasion of France. This debate, which continued through 1942 and 1943, was resolved in practice by a series of compromises. The North African campaign of 1942, Operation Torch, was carried out broadly as Churchill advocated. The Italian campaign that followed had British support and American reluctance in roughly equal measure. The cross-channel invasion, Operation Overlord, was eventually set for 1944, later than the Americans wanted and approximately when Churchill believed the conditions would be right. The three great summit conferences of the war, Tehran in November 1943, Yalta in February 1945, and the earlier Churchill-Stalin meeting in Moscow in October 1944, were the occasions at which the shape of the post-war world was negotiated. Churchill arrived at these conferences as the leader of a great power in the full ceremonial sense, and as the leader of a country whose relative power was declining relative to both America and the Soviet Union in ways that were becoming increasingly apparent. At Tehran, the first meeting of all three leaders together, Churchill was in some respects the odd man out. Roosevelt had a personal rapport with Stalin that he cultivated partly for strategic reasons and partly from a somewhat optimistic view of Soviet intentions that Churchill did not share. Churchill argued forcefully for his strategic views, but found himself outvoted on the cross-channel invasion and on the allocation of resources. The Moscow meeting of October 1944 produced what became known, somewhat euphemistically, as the Percentages Agreement, in which Churchill proposed to Stalin a division of influence in Eastern Europe, Romania 90% Soviet, 90% Western for Greece, Yugoslavia, and Hungary 50-50, and so on. It is one of the most controversial documents in Churchill's career. His defenders say it was a realistic acknowledgement of Soviet military power in Eastern Europe, and that it at least preserved Greece and Western Europe. His critics say it was an abandonment of the principle of national self-determination for which the war was supposedly being fought, and that it consigned hundreds of millions of Eastern Europeans to Soviet domination. Both things are probably true, and the tension between them is not entirely resolvable. At Yalta in February of 1945, Churchill was already aware that the post-war order was being shaped by a balance of power in which Britain counted for less than he had hoped. He secured what agreements he could on Poland's future borders and government, but he was aware that Soviet armies occupied most of Eastern Europe and that the agreements he was extracting had limited enforceability. He arrived at Yalta already ill, and photographs from the conference show a man who looked exhausted in a way that went beyond normal fatigue. The Grand Alliance was, in the end, what it needed to be: imperfect, uncomfortable, and sufficient. Three powers of incompatible political systems and conflicting long-term interests held together long enough to destroy the common enemy. Churchill was the architect and the manager of the British contribution to that alliance, and his contribution, in terms of the relationships he built, the diplomacy he conducted, and the strategic arguments he made and lost and made again, was essential to the outcome. He understood, perhaps more clearly than either of his partners, that alliances are not friendships. They are arrangements of mutual interest, held together by the reality that the alternative is worse. The alliance held because the alternative for all three was worse, and when the alternative was removed, as it would be in 1945, the alliance would dissolve with the same pragmatic logic that had created it. Churchill saw this coming. He was already thinking about the post-war world while the war was still being won. The turn of the tide, North Africa, Italy, and the road back 1942, was, of all the years of the Second World War from the British perspective, probably the most difficult. Not because the risk of immediate defeat was as acute as it had been in 1940, but because the distance to victory seemed so enormous and the news was so consistently bad. In the Far East, the Japanese had swept through Malaya and captured Singapore in February of 1942, a defeat that Churchill described as the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. The loss of Singapore was deeply personal to him, in a way that went beyond strategic calculation, because he had assumed that the fortress island, with its great naval base and its guns pointing out to sea, was defensible. He had not anticipated an attack through the jungle from the north. The speed and completeness of the Japanese advance shocked him, and his private anguish at the fall of Singapore was real. In North Africa, The British Army, under a series of commanders who were either inadequate or unlucky, found itself engaged in a seesaw campaign against Rommel's Afrika Korps that produced victories followed by retreats, followed by victories in a pattern that was exhausting, costly, and ultimately unresolved. Tobruk fell to Rommel in June of 1942, another blow of significant psychological magnitude. Churchill was, in these difficult months, subject to criticism in Parliament and in the press that was more sustained and more serious than anything he had faced since becoming Prime Minister. There were genuine doubts about his direction of the war, about his relationship with the Chiefs of Staff, about his strategic priorities. A vote of no confidence, though easily defeated, was a political signal that his leadership was not universally celebrated even among those who had welcomed it in May of 1940. He responded to these pressures in the way that was characteristic of him, by working harder, by making decisions, by travelling to the fronts himself. In August of 1942 he flew to Cairo, examined the situation in the Western Desert personally, and made the most consequential command appointment of the War in the Desert campaign. He replaced the commander of the Eighth Army with a series of substitutions that eventually, after one of the intended replacements was killed in an aircraft crash, produced the name of General Bernard Law Montgomery as commander of the Eighth Army. Montgomery, or Monty as he was universally known, was one of the more complicated figures of the war. He was supremely confident, famously difficult, and generally right about military matters in the specific, technical sense of how battles should be fought and won. He was also, let it be said, someone who presented Churchill with a particular challenge, because Monty was almost as convinced of his own rightness as Churchill was, and the two of them had a relationship that was productive precisely because they were both too strong-willed to simply agree with each other. Montgomery turned the Eighth Army around with a combination of professional thoroughness and very confident public leadership. He made himself visible to his troops, wore his famous beret rather than a general's cap, talked to ordinary soldiers in ways that commanding generals did not ordinarily do. He insisted on not fighting until he was ready, which infuriated Churchill considerably. Churchill wanted action, and wanted it immediately. Montgomery wanted to prepare, to build up his strength, to choose his moment. Montgomery's moment came at El Alamein on the 23rd of October 1942. The battle that followed was the turning point of the Desert War. The Eighth Army attacked Rommel's defensive lines with overwhelming force, built up over months of preparation, and after 11 days of hard fighting broke through. Rommel's Afrika Korps was in retreat. 2 weeks later, Operation Torch put American and British forces in French North Africa, squeezing Rommel from both sides. Churchill's description of El Alamein has become one of his most quoted political observations. He said that before Alamein, Britain had never had a victory. After Alamein, it had never had a defeat. This is not, strictly speaking, historically accurate, but it captures something true about the psychological significance of the moment. El Alamein was the first clear, unambiguous British victory of the war. The bells of British churches rang for it, the first time they had rung since the beginning of the war. It was a sound that meant something. The North African campaign concluded in May of 1943 with the surrender of the remaining Axis forces in Tunisia. 250,000 German and Italian troops were taken prisoner. The Mediterranean was now open to Allied shipping. The next step was Sicily and then the Italian mainland. The Italian campaign was the most contentious of all the debates between Churchill and the Americans. Churchill believed, with a passion that sometimes struck the American Chiefs of Staff as disproportionate, in the strategic importance of the Italian theatre. He called it the soft underbelly of Europe, a phrase that turned out to be somewhat optimistic given the nature of the Italian terrain and the quality of the German defensive generalship. The Americans were convinced it was a distraction from the main effort, which was the cross-channel invasion. Both sides had a point. The Italian campaign did tie down significant German forces that might otherwise have been deployed elsewhere. It also absorbed Allied resources that might have been used elsewhere. The bloody fighting up the Italian peninsula, the battles of Cassino and Anzio, the slow, costly advance through the mountains, extracted an enormous price in Allied casualties. Whether that price was worth paying is a question on which historians remain genuinely divided. Churchill visited the Italian front in August of 1944, getting closer to the actual fighting than any Prime Minister could reasonably justify. He was 69 years old, he was not well, and he appeared at various points in the forward areas in circumstances that caused his security staff considerable anxiety. He simply needed to see. He had always needed to see. By the time the Italian campaign ended in May of 1945, With the surrender of German forces in Italy, Europe was already in its final convulsion. D-Day, on the 6th of June 1944, had opened the second front that Stalin had demanded and that the Americans had long sought. Churchill had finally been reconciled to the operation and had been, in the last months before the invasion, deeply involved in its planning and preparation. The turn of the tide, which El Alamein had announced in late 1942, had become a flood by 1944. Germany was fighting on three fronts, against the Soviets in the east, against the Allied armies in France after D-Day, and against the Allied forces moving slowly north through Italy. The end was not yet visible, but it was becoming imaginable in ways that it had not been in the dark months of 1940 and 41. Churchill watched the progress with a complex mixture of satisfaction and anxiety. Satisfaction because the strategy he had advocated, the building of sufficient force before the decisive blow, had been broadly validated. Anxiety because the post-war world that was taking shape as the Soviet armies swept westward through Eastern Europe was not the world he'd hoped to see. The liberation of Europe from Nazism was bringing the expansion of Soviet power into regions that had not previously been within the Soviet sphere, and Churchill understood what this would mean for the peoples of those regions, with a clarity that his more optimistic allies did not always share. The road back had been won, but the road back led to a destination that was more complicated than the simple restoration of the pre-war world. Churchill saw this, he worried about it, and he was right to worry. D-Day and the liberation of Europe Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy on the 6th of June 1944, was the largest amphibious operation in military history. It had been 2 years in the planning, subject to the most intense strategic argument, refined and revised and rehearsed until the machinery of it was as complete as human ingenuity and industrial capacity could make it. It was also, for all its preparations, an operation of enormous risk, dependent on weather and surprise, and the individual courage of hundreds of thousands of men who would assault fortified beaches under fire. Churchill's role in D-Day is interesting and somewhat counterintuitive. He was, by the time of the invasion, genuinely supportive of the operation, having been reconciled to it by the force of American argument and the growing logistical reality that the cross-channel operation was not only possible but necessary. He was also, characteristically, extremely eager to participate in the invasion himself. He proposed to watch the naval bombardment from a British cruiser on D-Day. This proposal caused King George VI to intervene with the argument that if the Prime Minister was going, the King ought to go too, and that both of them could not reasonably be risked on a warship on the most dangerous day of the war. The argument eventually persuaded Churchill to stay ashore, though only after some very firm words from the King and considerable reluctance on Churchill's part. He crossed to Normandy 4 days after the invasion to see the beachhead for himself, as of course he did. He drove along the beach, observed the logistics of the landing operation, walked on French soil for the first time since Dunkirk, and was photographed looking satisfied, which he was. The liberation of France that followed was not the rapid triumph that some optimists had imagined it might be. The fighting in the bocage, the dense hedgerow country of Normandy, was brutal and slow. The Germans defended with the professionalism that characterized their army even in retreat. Progress was measured in fields and villages rather than miles. Montgomery, commanding the Allied ground forces in the initial stages, was criticized by the Americans for being too cautious, not pushing fast enough. The breakout from Normandy came at the end of July 1944 with Operation Cobra, the American armoured advance that cracked the German line and produced the rapid movement that transformed the campaign. From August onward, the pace accelerated dramatically. Paris was liberated on the 25th of August, with General de Gaulle entering the city in triumph in circumstances that Churchill had helped arrange, managing with some skill the complex politics of the Free French movement and the question of who would govern France in the aftermath. Churchill's relationship with de Gaulle is worthy of a separate chapter, which it is fortunately not going to get because we have quite enough on our hands already. The short version is that it was one of the most difficult relationships of the war, a partnership of mutual necessity between two men who respected each other's toughness and found each other almost impossibly exasperating on a personal level. De Gaulle was proud, suspicious, convinced that the Anglo-Americans were plotting to dominate France after liberation, and determined to assert French sovereignty and dignity at every possible point. Churchill was fond of France and committed to its restoration as a great power, but found de Gaulle's particular brand of principled obstruction maddening. He once said that the heaviest cross he had to bear was the Cross of Lorraine, referring to the Free French symbol and specifically to its creator. De Gaulle, when told this remark, apparently regarded it as a compliment. The Allied advance continued through Belgium and into the Netherlands in September of 1944. Operation Market Garden, the airborne operation intended to seize bridges over the Rhine and allow the Allied armies to enter Germany from the north, failed at its furthest point, the bridge at Arnhem, by a combination of German strength, Allied logistical difficulties, and what Field Marshal Montgomery later described as the plan being very nearly successful. The phrase very nearly came to represent the operation in military history. The reversal at Arnhem was followed by the German counter-offensive in December, the Battle of the Bulge, which briefly threatened to undo some of the gains of the autumn. Churchill, who was dealing simultaneously with the Italian campaign, the situation in Greece where a communist uprising had to be suppressed in circumstances that generated enormous controversy, and the deteriorating health that would continue to afflict him through the remainder of the war, managed the crisis with the calm that he could always produce in genuine emergencies. His visit to Athens in December of 1944, to deal personally with the political crisis there, was one of the more dramatic episodes of the late war period. He flew to Athens in extremely dangerous circumstances, landing at an airport still under fire, and presided over a conference intended to prevent a communist takeover of Greece. The decision to intervene in Greece, to use British force to suppress the communist uprising, was one of the most controversial of the war. It was attacked by the left in Britain as imperialism, as the suppression of a popular movement, as a betrayal of the anti-fascist principles for which the war was supposedly being fought. Churchill's position was that a Greece dominated by a communist movement backed by Soviet power would simply exchange one form of foreign domination for another, and that the British interest and the Greek interest lay in a Greece that could govern itself freely. He was right about this in the long run. Greece remained a Western democracy. The cost of being right was the accusation of betrayal from people who had expected the war to produce a transformed Europe. By the spring of 1945, Germany was collapsing. The Allied armies were across the Rhine and advancing toward Berlin from the west, while the Soviet armies were advancing from the east. The liberation of the concentration camps by advancing Allied forces in April of 1945 revealed to the world, in photographs and newsreel footage that could not be looked away from, the full and terrible reality of what Nazism had meant in practice. Churchill had known, from intelligence reports and from refugees, something of what was happening in the camps. He had not known the full scale, and the visual documentation when it came affected him deeply. He ensured that photographs were distributed widely, that the British public saw what had been done in the name of German racial ideology, that the argument for why the war had been fought was made with the evidence it deserved. On the 8th of May 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. Churchill's Victory in Europe Day address to the British nation was delivered from a balcony in Whitehall to an enormous crowd in the afternoon, and then broadcast on the radio. He told the people the war was won. He named the enemies overcome and the allies who had helped overcome them. He acknowledged the suffering and the cost. He said that they were entitled to a brief period of rejoicing. He was crying. In the photographs and the film footage of that day, you can see it. The relief, the pride, the grief for the dead, the enormous weight of what the previous 5 years had cost, all of it visible on the face of a man who had held the line for 5 years and who knew, better than anyone, how close it had come to going the other way. Victory and defeat, the election of 1945. What happened next was, from Churchill's personal perspective, one of the most extraordinary experiences of his remarkable life. He had won the war. He was by any measure the man most responsible for preventing the defeat of Britain in 1940, for holding the alliance together, for pursuing the strategic vision that had eventually produced victory. He was the most famous and probably the most admired political leader in the world. He was also, within 2 months of Germany's surrender, decisively defeated in a British general election and removed from office. The general election of July 1945 was the first British election since 1935, a full decade of wartime having intervened. The British people had been patient with the coalition government, had accepted the enormous impositions of wartime with a discipline that had not been guaranteed, and had now, with the war in Europe won, the opportunity to decide who should govern them in peace. Churchill appears to have assumed, with perhaps forgivable overconfidence, that the man who had led them through the war would be the man they wanted to lead them in peace. He was wrong about this in a way that is both understandable and instructive. The Labour Party under Clement Attlee had spent the war years in the coalition government and had demonstrated, quietly but effectively, that they were capable of administration and governance at the highest level. Attlee himself was one of the most underestimated politicians of the 20th century. He was Churchill's opposite in almost every superficial quality. He was small, quiet, pipe-smoking, precise, and utterly without flamboyance. He did not give speeches that moved people to tears. He ran meetings, made decisions, and got things done with an efficiency that Churchill himself acknowledged was impressive. More importantly, Labour had a programme. The Beveridge Report of 1942 had proposed the foundations of a comprehensive welfare state, offering security against unemployment, sickness, and poverty from cradle to grave. This proposal had been enormously popular. The British people, who had endured the depression of the 1930s as well as the war, wanted something specific to show for their sacrifices. They wanted the National Health Service. They wanted social insurance. They wanted a government that would address the structural inequalities of British society rather than simply restoring the pre-war order. Churchill's election campaign was, by most accounts, poorly managed and occasionally actively damaging. He made a broadcast in which he suggested, bizarrely and uncharacteristically ineptly, that a Labour government would require some form of Gestapo to enforce its socialist policies. This was a wild misjudgment of Clement Attlee and the Labour Party, and of the British public's ability to recognise the difference between democratic socialism and totalitarianism. Attlee's response was withering. He simply noted with characteristic precision that Mr. Churchill's Gestapo speech showed that the leader of the Conservative Party was entirely different from the leader of the wartime coalition government. The British people recognised the difference too, and rather liked Attlee's version of the comparison. The result, announced on the 26th of July 1945, was a Labour landslide. Labour won nearly 400 seats. The Conservatives were reduced to around 200. Clement Attlee became Prime Minister. Churchill was, by his own account, devastated. He had expected to see the war through to its conclusion in the Pacific, to be present at Japan's eventual surrender, to negotiate the peace settlement at Potsdam as the British Prime Minister. Instead, he left Potsdam after the election results were announced, Attlee returning in his place. He went home to Clementine, who told him later that she had said to him, in the middle of his distress, that it might be a blessing in disguise. He had replied that it was very effectively disguised. There is something almost comedic about the situation, and Churchill was too honest not to see it. The greatest war leader Britain had produced in centuries, the man who had saved the country in its darkest hour, rejected at the polls by the country he had saved the moment it could do so without being invaded. History has a complicated relationship with gratitude, but it is also, on reflection, perfectly understandable. The British electorate was not ungrateful, they were practical. They were voting for a future, not for a past. They recognised that winning the war and building the peace were different tasks requiring different qualities. They also recognised that Churchill, for all his brilliance, had not historically been the most reliable champion of the ordinary working person, and that his party's record on social policy in the interwar years was not a compelling argument for its social reform credentials. Churchill accepted the result with dignity. He wrote, he painted, he began work on his 6-volume memoir of the Second World War, which would be published through the early 1950s and which would win him the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1953. He went to the south of France and painted in the winter sun. He gave speeches. He was, even in opposition, one of the most prominent political figures in the world, because the war had made him not just a British politician, but a world figure. And world figures do not simply become invisible when they lose a domestic election. The defeat hurt. He was in private angry and sad and bewildered by it. Clementine, who had sometimes worried about what unconstrained power might do to her husband, and who was secretly somewhat relieved that he would no longer be carrying the impossible weight of wartime leadership, managed him with her characteristic combination of honesty and love. He walked, painted, wrote, and slowly recovered the equilibrium that was necessary for the next chapter. Because there was, of course, a next chapter. Churchill at 70 was not the sort of man who considered his career over. The Iron Curtain. Churchill in opposition. Opposition suited Winston Churchill rather better than it suited most politicians of his stature, because opposition gave him what he had always excelled at, the freedom to say exactly what he thought without the constraint of governmental responsibility. He was no longer required to manage alliances, to balance competing interests within a cabinet, to temper his views in the interests of diplomatic nicety. He could simply say what he believed. which was that the post-war world was taking a very dangerous shape and that the Western democracies were not paying sufficient attention to the evidence in front of them. In March of 1946, he was invited to speak at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri, with President Truman in attendance on the platform. The speech he delivered there, introduced by Truman and received with enormous attention across the English-speaking world, contained a phrase that entered the language and defined an era. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Churchill had used a version of this phrase in private communication earlier, but its public deployment at Fulton, in the presence of the American president, before a large audience and with reporters present, was a deliberate act of strategic communication. He was naming what was happening in Eastern Europe. He was describing the Soviet consolidation of control behind that curtain. He was warning that the democracies needed to understand the nature of the challenge they faced and respond to it with the same seriousness they had eventually brought to the challenge of Hitler. The speech was controversial. Many on the left in Britain and America, still inclined toward a conciliatory view of Soviet intentions, condemned it as warmongering. The Soviet government responded furiously, with Stalin himself accusing Churchill of calling for a new war against the Soviet Union. Harry Truman, who had introduced Churchill and had read the speech in advance, took some days to distance himself from its more controversial implications before eventually supporting its thrust. But the Iron Curtain speech was, in historical retrospect, precisely right. The Soviet Union was doing exactly what Churchill described. The Eastern European states that had been liberated from German occupation by Soviet forces were being incorporated into the Soviet sphere in ways that eliminated their effective independence. Free elections were being suppressed. Political oppositions were being arrested. The consolidation of Soviet-style communist governments in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary and East Germany was proceeding with the relentless logic that Churchill had predicted and that his more optimistic contemporaries had failed to see coming. He was also, in these years, building the European idea. His speech at Zurich in September of 1946 calling for a United States of Europe is one of the founding documents of the European movement. Churchill was not calling for British membership in a European federation. He was calling for the reconciliation of France and Germany as the core of a united Europe, explicitly seeing this as a project for continental Europeans rather than for Britain, which he envisioned as a sponsor and supporter rather than a member. This nuance has been somewhat lost in the subsequent political arguments about Churchill and Europe, with people on both sides of the contemporary debate claiming his authority for positions he did not, strictly speaking, advocate. But the Zurich speech is important because it reflects Churchill's understanding of what the Second World War meant for the future of Europe. The wars of his century, the First and the Second, had been European civil wars in which European nations had destroyed each other with increasing efficiency. The only way to prevent a third was to create structures that made European nations unable to fight each other. He believed this. He also believed that Britain's interests lay in good relations with both America and Europe, that it needed not to choose between the Atlantic relationship and the European one but to maintain both. Whether this was achievable in practice is a question that subsequent decades demonstrated to be considerably more complicated than Churchill imagined. As leader of the opposition, he was not very interested in the daily mechanics of parliamentary opposition. He left much of that to others, particularly Anthony Eden, who was being groomed as his successor and who bore a considerable amount of the day-to-day burden of conservative politics in these years. Churchill was occupied with his writing, his painting, his international speeches, and with the grand strategic view of the world that he felt it was his particular responsibility to articulate. He also enjoyed himself in these years in ways that had been impossible during the war. He went to the south of France, where the Riviera light was perfect for painting, and the weather was not the weather of London. He stayed at the villas of rich friends with a comfort that he found entirely appropriate. He ate and drank well, which he had always done and which his doctors always begged him to moderate, and which he showed no particular inclination to do. He played cards, he watched horse racing, he built things at Chartwell and walked in the grounds and fed his fish and his swans and was, between bouts of political activity and bouts of depression, sometimes simply happy. He also maintained a level of political engagement that no ordinary retired politician could have sustained. He was consulted by governments, by American presidents, by European leaders, by anyone who had a question about the nature of the world, and who thought that a man who had seen as much of it as Churchill had might have an instructive perspective. He was not, in this period, a former Prime Minister. He was a continuing presence in world affairs, a moral authority, a voice that carried the weight of what he had done and the clarity of what he continued to think. In 1951, the Conservative Party won the general election, and Churchill was Prime Minister again. He was 76 years old. He should, by any reasonable standard, have retired. He did not retire. He was not the retiring type. The return, Prime Minister again, and the long goodbye Churchill's second premiership, from October 1951 to April 1955, is one of the more poignant chapters of his story. He had been wanting to return to office since his defeat in 1945, partly out of a genuine belief that he still had things to contribute, and partly, one suspects, out of a need to demonstrate that 1945 had not been the verdict of history on his life. He got his return. It did not provide quite what he had hoped for. He was, by 1951, an old man in the way that matters most, which is to say that his physical and mental faculties, while still well above average for anyone of his age, were below the standard that he had maintained through the extraordinary decade of the war. He worked less at night. He took more naps, though he had always taken naps and considered them not a luxury but an operational necessity. He was harder of hearing. The strokes that had begun to affect him, the first significant one occurring in August of 1953, left him periodically incapacitated in ways that were carefully managed and carefully concealed from the public. His return to office was not without substance. He pursued the theme that had occupied him since Fulton, the possibility of a summit with the Soviet leadership, a direct meeting of the great powers that might reduce the dangerous tensions of the Cold War. Stalin died in March of 1953, and Churchill saw in the leadership transition an opportunity for diplomacy that the rigidities of the Cold War had previously prevented. He proposed a summit meeting and was frustrated in this by American reluctance, by Eisenhower's administration's suspicion of any arrangement that might appear to legitimize Soviet power, and by his own declining health. The post-war world that Churchill observed from Downing Street in his second premiership was very different from the world that he had entered politics to serve. The British Empire was dissolving. India had been independent since 1947. Other colonial territories were following. The world he had grown up in which Britain was the foremost global power and the British imperial system was the defining framework of international relations, had been replaced by a world organised around the competition between the United States and the Soviet Union, in which Britain was an important but clearly secondary power. He accepted this diminishment with more equanimity than might have been expected. He had always understood, with the strategic clarity that characterised his best thinking, that American power was the essential factor in the war, and that the post-war world would accordingly be an American-led one. He had invested heavily in the Anglo-American relationship precisely because he understood that British power was insufficient on its own. What was harder to accept, and what he occasionally expressed with a sadness that was not entirely concealed, was the sense that the Britain he had fought for was being transformed in ways that sometimes felt alien. The National Health Service, founded by the Labour government in 1948, was accepted by the Conservative government as a permanent feature of British life. The welfare state that Attlee's government had constructed was broadly maintained. These were things that Churchill had not advocated for in the terms that Labour had implemented them, but that he was sufficiently realistic not to challenge once they were established. He governed from the centre, which was where the electorate wanted governing from, and did not attempt the radical reversal of post-war settlements that his rhetoric sometimes suggested he favoured. His daily life in these final years in office combined the habits of a lifetime with the accommodations of old age. He still dictated, still loved the company of good talkers at his dinner table, still read voraciously, still had opinions on everything and expressed them freely. He was still, even diminished, one of the most alive people in any room he occupied. He resigned as Prime Minister on the 5th of April 1955. Anthony Eden succeeded him. The resignation dinner at Downing Street was attended by the Queen, which was unusual and reflected the personal regard in which she held him. He was 80 years old. He remained in Parliament until 1964, sitting as the member for Woodford in Essex, which he had represented since 1945. He attended less frequently as the years passed, but his presence when he did attend was an event. The House of Commons, which had been the arena of his life for more than 60 years, watched him walk to his seat on the Conservative benches, and understood it was seeing something that would not come again. He was made a Knight of the Garter in 1953, an honour that his father had declined, and that Winston accepted with the pride of a man who had earned it rather than inherited it. He was offered a dukedom and declined it, which was probably wise, since a dukedom would have removed him to the House of Lords and deprived him of the Commons he loved. He painted. He wrote. He fed his fish at Chartwell. He took holidays in the south of France with a devotion to the Mediterranean sun that reflected both its therapeutic quality and his genuine love of warm light and good food. He was, in these final years, famous in a way that had become simply a condition of his existence, the most recognised face in the world, the emblem of something that the 20th century had required and produced, and could not quite believe it had produced. Clementine managed his diminishment with the same combination of honesty and love that had characterised their entire life together. She worried about him, advocated for him, protected him from himself in the ways that she had always done. Their correspondence in these years is shorter because they were together more, but no less warm. He had his last great public occasion on the 30th of November 1954, his 80th birthday. The entire country marked it. Parliament presented him with a portrait by Graham Sutherland, which Churchill hated and said so, and which Clementine eventually had destroyed after his death, which is a detail that tells you rather a lot about both of them. The long goodbye was not, in the end, particularly long. He had a major stroke on the 15th of January 1965 and never really recovered. He died on the 24th of January, 70 years to the day after his father had died in the same month, which is the kind of coincidence that Churchill himself would have appreciated, given how much of his life had been spent in the shadow of that earlier death and what it had meant. The writer, the painter, the man. Churchill beyond politics. Winston Churchill won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1953. This fact is not as well known as it should be, and it surprises people who think of him primarily as a politician. The Nobel Committee cited his mastery of historical and biographical description, as well as brilliant oratory in defending exalted human values. This is as good a summary as any of what made Churchill's writing significant, though it omits the quality that anyone who has actually read his work notices immediately, which is that it is simply very good. He wrote about 15 million words over the course of his career. This is not a misprint. 15 million words, which is roughly equivalent to 20 average-length novels, spread across newspaper articles, books, speeches, memoranda, letters, and the 6 volumes of his war memoir, The Second World War, published between 1948 and 1954. He was not a writer in the way that novelists are writers, sitting alone in a room communing with the interior. He was a writer in the more public, performative sense that journalism and political memoir require. He dictated, pacing, gesturing, building a sentence in the air before it was written down. He worked with a team of researchers and secretaries and editors, though the prose that emerged was unmistakably his. He revised constantly. He was not satisfied with approximation or imprecision. He wanted the right word in the right place with the right rhythm, and he was willing to work until he found it. His early books, The Story of the Malakand Field Force and the River War, established the template. They were vivid, engaged, partisan, and written with the confidence of someone who had actually been there and was not going to pretend he hadn't. They were also, from the beginning, morally engaged in the sense that they were not content to describe what happened, but were committed to judging it, to asking whether what happened was right, necessary, justifiable. His biography of his father, Lord Randolph Churchill, published in 1906, is a remarkable work. It is ostensibly an objective biography, sourced from documents and interviews, following the conventions of Victorian political biography. It is also, transparently and movingly, a son's attempt to understand a father who died before understanding was possible. Churchill presents Lord Randolph's career with the generosity of genuine admiration and the honesty of someone who has looked at the evidence and cannot pretend it is simpler than it is. The World Crisis, his account of the First World War published in the 1920s, established him as a major historical writer. It is partial, in both senses of the word. It covers the war from Churchill's particular perspective, and it is not without bias in his own favour. But it is also immensely readable, analytically sophisticated, and contains some of the finest descriptive writing about naval warfare in the language. Marlborough. His Life and Times, the 4-volume biography of his ancestor John Churchill, 1st Duke of Marlborough, published through the 1930s, is by general consent his masterpiece as a writer. It is long. Very long in the way that Victorian multi-volume biographies are long, which is to say that if you're going to read it, you should probably clear your schedule. But it is brilliant. The military history is clear and precise. The political history is sophisticated. And the portrait of Marlborough himself, a man of genius fighting coalition warfare against a continental hegemon, is painted with such evident personal identification that reading it is like watching Churchill think through the problems he was himself facing in the 1930s by imagining them in a different century. The Second World War, published in 6 volumes after the war, is a different kind of book. It is memoir more than history. It is Churchill's account of Churchill's war, and it is unabashedly so. He was not pretending to write an objective history. He was writing an account of events as he saw them and participated in them, and he was including the documents that supported his view of those events. The result is both essential historical evidence and a magnificent act of self-presentation. Future historians have found plenty to argue within it. They have also found it completely impossible to ignore. His painting deserves serious attention as well, and it does not always receive it. He was a genuinely accomplished artist, not a hobby painter who happened to be a famous politician. His friend and fellow artist Walter Sickert said that he painted like a man who had only a few years to live, which was a strange thing to say about someone who turned out to have many decades, but which captured the urgency and the boldness of his brushwork. He painted with oil, working quickly and with considerable physical engagement, standing at the canvas, mixing colours with the confidence of someone who trusted his eye. He painted landscapes primarily. The south of France was a favourite subject, particularly Marrakesh in Morocco, which he visited several times and which he loved for the clarity of its light and the drama of its colours. He painted at Chartwell, in the grounds and the surrounding countryside. He painted on his holidays with the same concentration that he brought to his writing. He found in painting what he found nowhere else, a complete absorption that silenced the interior world and replaced it with the purely visual problem of how to put on canvas what was in front of his eyes. He wrote about painting with the same intelligence and the same accessibility that characterized his best prose. His essay on painting as a pastime, written in the 1920s, is a small masterpiece of practical wisdom about the creative life. He describes the discovery of painting in 1915, when Gallipoli had brought him to the lowest point of his existence, with a candour that reveals how much it meant. He describes picking up a brush for the first time and the moment when the act of making a mark on a blank canvas felt like a door opening. He describes the therapeutic power of needing to look so hard at what is in front of you that there is no room for anxiety about anything else. Beyond the writing and the painting, there is Churchill, a man of conversation, the diner, the host, the presence in a room. He was one of the great talkers of his century, a man whose conversation at its best was as carefully constructed as his prose and as vivid as his painting. He loved a good story, a good argument, a good joke. He could be pompous, he could be insensitive, he could occupy all the conversational oxygen in a room without noticing it. He could also, and this surprised people who expected nothing but grand pronouncements, be very funny. His wit was both constructed and spontaneous. Some of his best lines were clearly prepared, polished, deployed at the right moment with the timing of a professional performer. Others appear to have been entirely impromptu, the product of a mind that moved fast enough to find the perfectly shaped phrase in the moment. The difficulty is that the prepared lines are often attributed as impromptu, and the impromptu ones are sometimes suspected of being prepared, which means that the question of which is largely unanswerable. He loved animals with a genuine and uncomplicated affection that contrasted with the complexity of many of his human relationships. The cats at Downing Street were his particular companions during the war. He kept pigs at Chartwell, of which he was fond, and once said that a dog looks up to you, a cat looks down on you, but a pig looks you directly in the eye as an equal. The goldfish in his ponds at Chartwell received his daily attention. The swans on his lake were his to command, or at least he liked to think so. He was, beyond the history and the politics and the rhetoric, a person of enormous appetite for life in all its forms. Food and drink, conversation and argument, sun and sea and the southern light, books and painting and animals and building things with his own hands. He was not a man for whom moderation held much appeal, and while this created problems in various parts of his life, it also made him intensely, undeniably alive, in a way that is not common and is not easily forgotten by those who encountered it. He was many things. He was a great writer and a flawed one. He was a great leader and a complicated one. He was a great man in the fullest and most honest sense of that phrase, meaning a man of very large dimensions whose greatness and whose failures were both larger than ordinary. He should be understood whole, not simplified in either direction, not reduced to the statue in Parliament Square or to the collection of his worst judgments. He was both, and the more is what makes him worth a lifetime's attention. Legacy. The myth, the man, and what he left behind. Winston Churchill died on the 24th of January 1965. He was 90 years old. He had been a public figure for 65 years, and a private one for arguably none of them. The news of his death was not unexpected, since he had been declining slowly and visibly for several years, but it was received with the weight of genuine loss in Britain and across the world in ways that reflected how completely he had become something more than a politician. His state funeral on the 30th of January was one of the largest in British history. The coffin was carried on a gun carriage through the streets of London past crowds that lined the route in silence. Representatives of 112 nations attended the service at St. Paul's Cathedral. Along the Thames, ships and dockers lowered their cranes as the launch carrying the coffin passed, a spontaneous gesture of respect from working men that had not been organised or requested by anyone. He was then taken by special train to Bladon, the small churchyard near Blenheim Palace where his parents were buried, and interred there in a private ceremony attended only by family. He is not in Westminster Abbey, where most British statesmen of comparable significance are buried. He is in a village churchyard in Oxfordshire, within sight of the palace where he was born. Whether this was deliberate symbolism or simply family preference is unclear, but it has the quality of a good Churchill story, which is that it makes a point almost without trying. The legacy he left is both simpler and more complicated than the mythology suggests. The simple version is that Churchill saved Britain and possibly Western civilization in 1940 by refusing to contemplate defeat when defeat would have been the rational choice. This version is substantially true. The decision to fight on rather than seek terms in late May of 1940 was the decision that kept the war going. Everything that followed, the Battle of Britain, the alliance with Russia, the entry of America, the liberation of Europe, depended on it. Without it, the story has a different and darker ending. Churchill made that decision and made it hold. But the legacy is more complicated, and honesty requires saying so. His record on India is a substantial stain. His opposition to Indian independence, his dismissal of Gandhi, his response to the Bengal famine of 1943, in which somewhere between 2 and 3 million people died, partly as a result of wartime policy decisions over which he had authority. These are parts of his record that cannot be excised and should not be minimised. He was a man of his time in the sense that his views were common among the British imperial class of his generation. He was also a man who prided himself on seeing further than common wisdom, and on this subject he did not see further. He saw considerably less far, and the consequences were borne by people who had no means of holding him accountable. He was capable of genuine malice in the political arena. He could be ruthless with his enemies and sometimes with people who were not his enemies but had merely crossed him. He was, in private, capable of a cruelty that his public image as the great humanist did not advertise. These things are true, and they belong in the accounting. And yet the 1940s were real. The speeches were real. The decisions were real. The refusal to surrender in June of 1940 was real, and it mattered more than almost anything else in the 20th century. A man can be wrong about many things and right about one thing that dwarfs all the others. Churchill was that man. His influence on the English language was permanent and probably irreversible. The Iron Curtain, their finest hour, blood, toil, tears, and sweat. These are not merely quotations. They are part of the structure of the language now, the vocabulary in which certain ideas are naturally expressed, because Churchill expressed them first, and expressed them so well that no subsequent expression has displaced them. He left behind a standard of what political courage looks like at its most tested. Not a comfortable standard, not a simple one, not one that admits of easy imitation, but a standard of what clear-eyed refusal to surrender can produce when the moment is the right one. That standard is there for anyone who needs to look at it. Churchill believed in June of 1940, alone at the edge of the world, that history could move in the direction of something better if there were people willing to believe it could. And history moved. And so we reach the end of tonight's journey. From Blenheim Palace on a cold November night in 1874 to a village churchyard in Oxfordshire in January of 1965. 90 years. One extraordinary life. The darkness outside your window is quiet now. The weight of history can be set down. Churchill would have approved of the sleeping listener, being a devoted napper himself. He once said you must sleep between lunch and dinner and no half measures, sleep in bed. That way you get 2 days in one. So close your eyes. The war is won. The night is quiet. Sleep well.